Section 1 of Quod Deus Homo by Anselm of Canterbury, translated by Edward S. Prout. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Preface. I have been compelled to complete the following work in the best way I could, more hastily than was convenient to me, and therefore more briefly than I wished, on account of certain persons who, before it was finished and revised, copied the first part of it for themselves. For I should have inserted and added many things on which I have said nothing, if I had been allowed to publish it in quiet and at a suitable time. For it was in great tribulation of heart which I suffered, the source and reasons of which God knows, that, when asked, I began the work in England, and finished it when an exile in the province of Capua. I have named it after the subject on which it was published, Quod Deus Homo, and I have divided it into 2 short books. The first of these contains the objections of unbelievers who reject the Christian faith because they think it contrary to reason, and the answers of believers, and finally it proves by necessary reasoning that, Christ being left out of the question as though nothing were known of him, it is impossible for any man to be saved without him. In the second book, in the same way, as if nothing were known of Christ, it is shown, by none the less clear reasoning and truth, that human nature has been constituted for this end, that hereafter the whole man, i.e. both body and soul, should enjoy a blessed immortality, and that it was necessary that this end, on account of which man was made, should be effected by a man, but only by means of a God-man, and therefore that necessarily all things which we believe respecting Christ ought to take place. I charge all who wish to copy this book to prefix at its commencement this short preface, with the titles of the chapters of the whole work, so that into whosoever hands it may fall, he may see, as it were, in its very forefront, whether there is anything in the whole body of it which he ought not to neglect. End of Section 1. Section 2 of Quod Deus Homo by Anselm of Canterbury, translated by Edward S. Prout. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Book 1, Chapters 1 to 5. Anselm, read by In the Desert.
Voso, read by Larry Wilson.
Book 1. I have been often and most earnestly asked by many, both by word and letter, that I would commit to writing the reasons I am accustomed to give to inquirers respecting our belief on a certain question, so that they may be remembered. For they say that my reasons please them, and they think them satisfactory. They seek this, not that they may attain to belief by means of reasoning, but that they may be charmed by my understanding and meditating on those things which they do believe, and that, as far as possible, they may be ready to give satisfaction to everyone asking a reason of the hope that is in them. Unbelievers also, who deride Christian simplicity as absurd, are wont to cast this question in our teeth, and many believers ponder it in their hearts, viz., for what reason or necessity God was made man, and by his death, as we believe, restored life to the world. For he could have done this by means of some other person, angelic or human, or by his will alone. On this question it is not only the learned, but many of the unlettered, who seek and long for a reasonable account of it. Since therefore many ask me to deal with this subject, though the inquiry seems very difficult, yet the solution is intelligible to all, and attractive because of the usefulness and beauty of the reasoning. Although what has been said by the Holy Fathers upon it ought to be sufficient, nevertheless I will take pains to show to inquirers what God will deign to reveal to me. And since subjects which are investigated by means of question and answer are much plainer to many minds, and especially to those that are slower of comprehension, and thus please them better, out of the men who earnestly inquire on this matter, I will select one, who more eagerly than others presses this work upon me, to discuss it with me, so that Boso may inquire, and Anselm may answer in the following way.
As the right order of things requires that we believe the deep things of the Christian faith before we presume to discuss them by reason, so it seems to me to be a sign of negligence if, after we have been confirmed in the faith, we are not eager to understand what we believe. Wherefore, since, by the prevenient grace of God, I think that I hold the faith respecting our redemption so firmly that even if I could not comprehend what I believe by any process of reasoning, there is nothing which could tear me away from its firm basis. I beg you to explain to me what, as you are aware, many as well as myself are seeking to know, viz., by what necessity, and for what reason, God, since he is omnipotent, took on himself the humiliation and weakness of human nature for the sake of its restoration.
What you ask of me is above me, and I fear to discuss truths which are too high for me, lest perchance when anyone has thought or even perceived that I did not satisfy him, he should think that I was in error as to the truth of the subject, rather than that my intellect was not sufficient to grasp it.
You ought not to fear this so much as to remember that it often happens in conversation respecting any question that God makes clear what was concealed before, and to hope from the grace of God that if you freely impart what you have freely received, you will be counted worthy to receive loftier truths to which you have not yet attained.
There is another thing also on account of which I see that we can hardly, if at all, deal fully with this subject between ourselves, because for our object a knowledge both of power and necessity and free will is needful, and of certain other things which are so connected that no one of them can be freely considered without the others, and the treatment of each of them requires a work by itself, not very easy, I think, nor altogether useless, for ignorance on these subjects makes some things difficult, which, by the knowledge of them, become easy.
You can speak briefly on these subjects in their proper place, so that we may have what is enough for our present purpose, and what needs further to be said we can defer to another time.
Then, too, the following thought makes me reluctant to grant your request, because not only is the subject of great importance, but as it relates to one who is fair in form above the sons of men, so it must be carried on by a method of reasoning which is fair above the understandings of men. Hence I fear that, as I am wont to be indignant with bad painters when I see our Lord himself painted in an ugly form, so it may befall me if I presume to describe so glorious a subject in inelegant and despicable language.
But even this ought not to deter you, because while you permit anyone who can speak better on the subject, you do not forbid anyone who is not pleased with your language from writing more elegantly. In fact, to put an end to all your excuses, you will be doing what I ask not for the learned, but for me, and for those who join me in the request.
Since I perceive the importunity of yourself and those friends of yours who seek this from love and devout zeal, I will try to the best of my ability, through the help of God and of your prayers, which, when asking me, you have all often promised for this very purpose, not so much to show you what you are seeking as to seek it with you. But it must be on the condition on which I wish all that I say to be received, viz., that if I shall have said anything that a higher authority does not confirm, although I seem to prove it by reason, it be not received as a certainty, but only as what in the meanwhile seems true to me, until God in some way gives me a clearer revelation. For if to some extent I am able to satisfy your inquiry, it ought to be regarded as certain that one wiser than myself will be able to do this more fully. For indeed we must know that whatever a man can say or write on the subject, the deeper reasons for so great a truth still remain concealed.
Suffer me then to use the words of unbelievers, for it is fair that since we desire to inquire into the reason of our faith, we place before ourselves the objections of those who are not at all willing to attain to the same faith without reason. For although they seek for reason from the fact that they do not believe, we do so because we believe. Nevertheless, it is one and the same thing which we are seeking. And if you say anything in reply which seems to be opposed to sacred authority, permit me to lay that authority before you, that you may explain how there is no contradiction.
Say what seems good to you.
Unbelievers deride our simplicity, and bring forward as an objection to our view that we offer injury and reproach to God when we assert that he descended to the Virgin's womb, was nourished and grew by milk and other of men's foods, and not to mention many other things which do not seem suitable to God, that he endured weariness, hunger, thirst, strokes, crucifixion, and death between the robbers.
We offer no injury or reproach to God, But thanking him with all our hearts, we praise and proclaim the ineffable depth of his mercy. For the more marvelous and contrary to all expectation it was that he should deliver us from such great and deserved evils in which we were involved, and restore us to the enjoyment of such great and undeserved blessings, the greater was the love and kindness he showed to us. For if they would carefully consider how fitting it was that man's restoration should be procured in this way, they would not deride our simplicity, but would join us in praising the wise beneficence of God. For it was fitting that as by a man's disobedience death entered the human race, so by a man's obedience should life be restored. And just as sin, which was the cause of our condemnation, had its beginning from a woman, so should the author of our righteousness and salvation be born of a woman. And as the devil had conquered man by the tasting of a tree to which he persuaded him, so by the suffering endured on a tree which he inflicted, should he by a man be conquered. There are many other things also which, when carefully considered, show a certain ineffable beauty in our redemption having been procured in this way.
All these things may be recognized as beautiful, and yet, as it were, mere pictures. But if there is nothing solid on which they rest, they do not seem to unbelievers to give sufficient reasons for believing that God was willing to suffer the things which we say he did. For a man who wishes to paint a picture selects something solid on which to paint, so that his painting may remain. For no one paints on water or in air, because no traces of his picture remain there. Wherefore, when we present to unbelievers these congruities of which you speak, as though they were pictures of a reality, since they think there is no such reality, but that it is a figment which we believe, they consider it as though we painted on a cloud. We must therefore first show a reasonable foundation for the truth, i.e., some necessity which may prove that God ought or could have stooped to the humiliation which we proclaim. Then that the body, so to speak, of truth may be made to shine more brightly, those congruities like pictures of that body must be explained.
Does it not seem a sufficiently needful reason why God should do what we assert, that the human race, so precious a work of God's, was utterly ruined, that it was not fitting that what God had purposed respecting man should be completely brought to naught, and that this very plan could not be carried into effect unless the human race were liberated by its Creator himself?
If this liberation of which you speak could be said to have been effected in any way you please, except by the person of God, whether by an angel or a man, the human mind would accept this much more readily. For God could make some man without sin, not from the sinful mass, nor from any other man, but as he made Adam, by whom it seems this very work might have been done.
But do you not see that whatever other person redeemed man from eternal death, man would rightly be regarded as his servant? And if this had been the case, man could by no means have been restored to that dignity which he was destined to hold if he had not sinned. For man himself, who should have been the servant of God alone and equal to the good angels in all things, would be the servant of one who is not God, and whom the angels did not serve. End of section 2. Section 3 of Cur Deus Homo by Anselm of Canterbury, translated by Edward S. Prout. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Book 1, Chapters 6 to 10.
This is what they most marvel at, that we call this liberation a redemption. For they say to us, in what captivity, or in what prison, or in whose power were you held, from which God could not deliver you, unless he redeemed you by so many labors, and at last by his own blood? But when we say to them, he redeemed us from sins, and from his own wrath, and from hell, and from the power of the devil, whom he overcame for us because we could not conquer him ourselves, and he redeemed for us the kingdom of heaven, and by thus doing all this he showed how much he loved us, they reply, if you say that God could not do all these things by a mere command, though you assert that he created all things by a word, you contradict yourselves by representing him as not almighty. Or if you confess that he was able, but was not willing to do these things except in this way, how can you prove him wise? For you assert that he chose to suffer things so unbecoming to him without any reason. For all these things which you allege that he did depend upon his own will. For the wrath of God is nothing else than his will to punish. If therefore he does not will to punish the sins of men, man is free from sins, and from the wrath of God, and from hell, and from the power of the devil, all which things he endures on account of sin. And he receives those things which he forfeited on account of those same sins. For in whose power is hell or the devil, or to whom does the kingdom of heaven belong, except to him who made all things? So that whatever things you dread or long for, they are subject to the will of him whom nothing can resist. Wherefore, if he was unwilling to save the human race except in that way which you allege, since he could have done so by his will alone, observe how, to say the least, you oppose his wisdom. For if a man without any reason were to do by severe labor what he could have done with perfect ease, no one would consider him by any means a wise man. Inasmuch as you assert that God thus showed how greatly he loved us, this cannot be defended by any reason unless it is shown that God could not save us in any other way. For if he could not have done it in any other way, then perhaps it was necessary that he should show his love in this way. But now, since he can save man in another way, what reason is there, in order to show his love, he should do and endure those things which you assert? For does he not show to the good angels how much he loves them, though he does not endure such things for them? And whereas you say that he came to conquer the devil for you, in what sense do you dare say this? Does not the omnipotence of God reign everywhere? How then was it needful for God to descend from heaven in order to conquer the devil? These are the objections which unbelievers seem able to bring against us. But there is the following statement also which we are wont to make, viz., that God was bound to take action against the devil by a judicial process before he did so by putting forth of power, in order to liberate man; so that when the devil slew him in whom was no cause of death, and who was God, he should justly lose the power which he had over sinners. Otherwise God would have done an act of unjust violence to the devil, since he was justly in possession of man, whom he had not drawn to himself by force, but man of his own accord had surrendered himself to him. I do not see the force of this argument, for if the devil or man belonged to himself or to anyone else but God, or were in the power of anyone else but God, perhaps such a statement might be rightly made. But since neither the devil nor man belong to anyone but God, and neither of them exists apart from the power of God, what reason was there for God to deal with his own creature concerning his own in his own, unless to punish his servant who had persuaded his fellow servant to desert their common Lord and succeed to him, and as a traitor had taken charge of a fugitive, a thief of a fellow thief in possession of the stolen property of his Lord? For each of them was a thief, since one by the other's persuasion stole himself from his Lord. For what could be more just if God were to do this? Or if God, the judge of all, rescued man, thus held from the power of him who so unjustly held him, either for the purpose of punishing him, or in some other way than by means of the devil, or in order to spare him, what injustice would be done? For although man might be justly tormented by the devil, it would nevertheless be unjust for the devil to torment him. For man had deserved to be punished, nor could he be punished more suitably by any one than by him with whom he had consented to sin. But the devil had gained no right to punish him. Indeed, it was all the more unjust in him to do this, because he was not led to it by love of justice, but was impelled by the instinct of malice. For he did not do this at God's command, but by the permission of his incomprehensible wisdom, by which he overrules all things for good. And I think that those who consider that the devil has any just claim to keep possession of man are led to this conclusion because they see that man is justly given up to be vexed by the devil, and that God is just in permitting this. So they think that the devil justly brings this torment upon him. For it happens that the very same thing may be both just and unjust when looked at from different points of view. And thus, if persons do not carefully look into the matter, it is judged to be altogether just or altogether unjust. For suppose any one should strike an innocent man unjustly, and in consequence should justly deserve to be smitten himself. But if the man who was struck ought not to take the law into his own hands, and yet strike his assailant, he acts unjustly. This blow, therefore, on the side of him who returns the blow is unjust, but on the side of him who receives it, it is just. For by striking unjustly, he justly deserved to be struck in return. So that from a different point of view, the same act is both just and unjust, for it may be judged by one person to be only just and by another unjust. In this way, therefore, the devil is said justly to plague men, because God justly permits this and man justly suffers it. But when it is said that man suffers justly, he is not said to suffer justly from his own view of justice, but because he is punished by the just judgment of God. And if that handwriting of ordinances is brought forward, which the Apostle says was against us, and was said to be blotted out by the death of Christ, and anyone suppose by this is meant the devil, as if under the handwriting of a certain contract, might justly exact from man, before the death of Christ, both sin, as though it were interest for the first sin to which he persuaded man, and the penalty of sin, so that in this way it seems to prove his claim on man, I do not think that the passage is at all to be understood in that way. For that handwriting is not the devil's, since it is said to be a handwriting of ordinances, but those ordinances were not the devil's, but God's. For it had been decreed by the just judgment of God, and confirmed as it were by a handwriting, that man who by his own accord had sinned, could by his own efforts escape neither sin nor the punishment of sin. For he is a wind that passeth away, and cometh not again. And whosoever committeth sin is the servant of sin. Neither ought he who sins to be let off with impunity, unless mercy spares the sinner, and liberates and reclaims him. So that we ought not to believe that by this handwriting we can discover that the devil has any just claim for tormenting man. In fine, just as in a good angel there is no injustice at all, so in a bad angel there's absolutely no justice. So that in the devil there was no reason why God should not use his might against him in order to deliver man.
The will of God ought to be a sufficient reason for us when he does anything, though we may not see why he so wills it, for the will of God is never unreasonable.
That is true, if it is certain that God's will is the reason of its being done. But many do not at all agree that God wills a thing if it seems contrary to their reason.
What seems to you contrary to reason, when we confess that God willed these things, which we believe respecting his incarnation?
To speak briefly, that the Most High should stoop to such humiliation, that the Almighty should do anything with so great a labor.
Those who say this do not understand what we believe, for we assert that the divine nature is undoubtedly incapable of suffering, and cannot at all be humbled from its lofty estate, or toil in anything it wills to do. But we say that the Lord Jesus Christ was true God and true man, one person in two natures, and two natures in one person. Wherefore, when we say that God suffers any humiliation or infirmity, we do not understand it of the loftiness of his impassible nature, but of the infirmity of his human substance, which he assumed. And thus it is seen that there is no reasonable objection to our faith, for thus we indicate that there was no humiliation of the divine substance, but we show that there was one person, both God and man, so that in the incarnation no humiliation of God is understood to have taken place, but the nature of man is believed to have been exalted.
Granted. Let nothing be imputed to the divine nature which is said respecting Christ in regard to human infirmity. But how can it be proved to be just or reasonable that God thus treated, or permitted to be thus treated, that man whom he called his beloved Son, in whom he was well pleased, and whom the Son claimed to be? For what justice is there in delivering the most righteous man of all to death for the sinner? What man, if he condemned an innocent man that he might liberate one who was guilty, would not himself be judged worthy of condemnation. And so the matter seems to be brought back to the same incongruous conclusion mentioned above. For if he could not save sinners in any other way than by condemning a righteous person, where is his omnipotence? But if he could, but would not, how can we defend his wisdom or justice?
God the Father did not treat that man at all in the way you seem to understand, nor did he deliver to death the innocent for the guilty. For he did not compel him to die or permit him to be killed against his will, but Christ himself of his own free will endured death that he might save man.
But even if he was not unwilling, since he consented to his Father's will, yet in a certain sense God seems to have compelled him by his command. For it is said that Christ humbled himself and became obedient to the Father unto death, even the death of the cross. Wherefore God also hath highly exalted him, and also that he learned obedience by the things which he suffered. And that the Father spared not his own Son, but delivered him up for us all. And the Son himself says, I came not to do mine own will, but the will of him that sent me. And when on the way to his passion he says, As the Father gave me commandment, even so I do. And also, the cup which my Father hath given me, shall I not drink it? And elsewhere, Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as thou wilt. In all these passages, Christ is represented as having endured death rather by the constraint of obedience than by the inclination of his own free will.
You do not clearly distinguish, as it seems to me, between what he did at the requirement of obedience and what he endured when done to him, though his obedience did not require this, because he held fast his obedience.
I want you to explain this more clearly.
Why did the Jews persecute him even to death?
For no other reason than because by his life and words he held fast to truth and righteousness without wavering.
I suppose that God requires this from every reasonable creature, and every creature owes this to God as a matter of obedience.
We must acknowledge this.
That man, therefore, owed such obedience to God the Father, and the human nature to the divine, and the Father required this from him.
No one doubts this.
So you see what he did at the requirement of obedience.
True, and already I see what he endured when inflicted on him because he persevered in obedience. For death was inflicted on him because he persisted in obedience, and he endured this. But how is it that obedience did not require his death? I do not understand.
If man had never sinned, ought he to suffer death, or ought God to require it of him?
According to our belief, man would neither have died, nor would God have required this of him. But I should like to hear the reason of this from you.
You do not deny that the rational creature was made righteous in order that he might be blessed by the enjoyment of God?
No.
You do not all think it proper for God to compel the creature whom he made righteous in order that he might be blessed, to be miserable without any fault of his own, for it is misery for a man to die against his will.
It is clear that if man had not sinned, God ought not to have required death from him.
God did not therefore compel Christ, in whom was no sin, to die, but Christ himself voluntarily endured death, not to show his obedience in abandoning life, but on account of his obedience in holding fast his righteousness, in which he so bravely persevered, that on that account he incurred death. For it may be said that the Father commanded him to die, since he commanded him to do that by which he incurred death. It was in this way, therefore, that, as the Father gave him commandment, even so he did, and the cup which the Father gave him he drank, and he became obedient to the Father unto death, and learned obedience by the things which he suffered. That is, he learned how far obedience ought to be maintained. But the word learnt may be understood in two ways. For he learnt is used either for he made others learn, or it means that what he was not ignorant of by mere knowledge he learnt by experience. Moreover, when the Apostle said he humbled himself and became obedient to death, even the death of the cross, he added, Wherefore God also hath highly exalted him, and given him a name which is above every name. And this is like what David said, He drank of the brook in the way, therefore he lifted up his head. so that the statement is not made as though he could not have reached this exaltation except by obedience unto death, or that this exaltation would not have been conferred upon him except as a recompense for this obedience. For before he suffered, he himself said that all things were delivered to him by the Father, and that all things that the Father hath were his. But since he himself with the Father and the Holy Spirit had determined that he should not show to the world the loftiness of his omnipotence in any other way than by death, inasmuch as it had been determined that this should be done only by means of that death, when the exaltation is effected by means of it, it is not improperly said to be done on account of it. For if we intend to do anything, but plan to do something else first, by means of which that other thing shall be done, when the thing which we wish to precede the other has been done, should our original intention be carried out, it is rightly said therefore to take place. For this first was done on account of what was postponed, since it had been determined that the one thing should take place by means of the other. For if there is a river which I can cross either on a horse or in a vessel, but I determine that I will only cross in a vessel, and therefore postpone going over it, because there is no vessel there, when the vessel has come, if now I cross, it is truly said respecting me, the vessel was ready, therefore he crossed over. And we do not only speak thus when it is by means of something which we wish to be done first that we determine to do something else, but when one thing merely precedes another. For if anyone puts off taking a meal because he has not yet on that day been present at the celebration of Mass, when he has done what he determined to do first, there is no impropriety in saying unto him, Now take your meal, because you have already done that for the sake of which you put it off. Much less extraordinary, therefore, is the expression in which Christ is said to have been exalted, because he endured the death by which, and after which, he determined to accomplish his exaltation. In this way, too, we can understand how the Lord himself is said to have increased in wisdom and favour with God, not that it was so, but that he conducted himself as if it was so. For he was exalted after death, as though it were on account of it. And as to his words, I came not to do mine own will, but the will of him that sent me, they are similar to what he says elsewhere, My doctrine is not mine. For what a man has not from himself, but from God, he ought to regard as not so much his own as God's. For no one has from himself the truth which he teaches, or a righteous will, but from God. Christ came, therefore, not to do his own will, but the Father's, because the righteous will which he had was not from his human, but his divine nature. But the words, God spared not his own Son, but delivered him up for us all, mean only that he did not release him. For many passages of this kind are found in the sacred Scriptures. But when he says, Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me, nevertheless, not as I will, but as thou wilt, and if this cup may not pass away from me, except I drink it, thy will be done, he means by his own will that natural desire for safety, by which his human flesh was shrinking from the pain of death. He speaks indeed of his Father's will, not that his Father preferred the death of his Son to his life, but because the Father was unwilling that the human race should be restored, unless one who was man should do some great act, such as that death of his was. Since reason did not demand what another could not do, the Son says that he, the Father, willed his, the Son's death, since the Father preferred the Son to suffer rather than that the human race should not be saved. It is as though he said, Since thou willest that the reconciliation of the world shall be effected in no other way, I declare that in this way thou willest my death. Let thy will therefore take place, i.e., let my death take place, that the world may be reconciled to thee. For we often say that a person wills something because he does not will something else, which if he did, that other thing, which he is said to will, would not take place. Thus we may say that a person wills to extinguish a lamp, because he does not choose to shut a window by which a draught enters that puts out the lamp. In this way, therefore, the Father willed the death of his Son, because he willed that the world should not be saved in any other way, except by man doing some great thing, as I have already said. And since the Son wished for the salvation of man, for no one else was able to effect it, this will of the Father had as great power as if God had commanded him to die. And hence, as the Father gave him commandment, so he did, and the cup which the Father gave him he drank, being obedient unto death. Chapter 10. It may be also rightly understood that by means of that pure will, whereby the Son was willing to die for the salvation of the world, the Father gave him, though not by compulsion, the command and the cup of suffering, and spared him not, but delivered him up for us, and willed his death, and that the Son himself was obedient unto death, and learnt obedience by the things which he suffered. For just as, merely as a man, he had not from himself the will to live righteously, but from the Father, so too he could not have that will by which he was willing to die, in order to accomplish so great a good, except from the Father of lights, from whom cometh every good gift and every perfect gift. For as the Father is said to draw men by giving them the will, so there is no impropriety if it is asserted that he constrains them. For as the Son said respecting the Father, No man cometh to me, except the Father draw him, so he might say, except he constrain him. In like manner also he could have declared, No man hasteneth to death for my name's sake, except the Father constrain him or draw him. For since every one is drawn or constrained to whatever he unalterably wills, there is no impropriety in saying that God draws or constrains when he gives such a will. But in this drawing or constraint no violence need be supposed, but a willing and loving clinging to that good choice which he has made his own. If therefore it cannot be denied that in this way the Father, by giving that will, drew or constrained the Son to death, who cannot fail to see by the same reasoning that he gave a command to him that he should freely endure death, and a cup which, though not against his will, he should drink? And if the Son is truly said not to have spared himself, but of his own free will to have delivered himself up for us, who can deny that it is truly said that the Father, from whom he received such a will, spared him not, but gave him up for us all, and willed his death? For in this way, by unalterably and spontaneously keeping the will which he had accepted from the Father, the Son was made obedient to him unto death, and learned obedience by the things which he suffered. That is, he learned how much may be achieved by obedience. For there is a true and simple obedience only when a rational nature, not by necessity but by spontaneity, keeps the will which it has received from God. In other ways too we may rightly understand that the Father willed the death of his Son, though these we have mentioned may suffice. For as we say that he wills a thing who causes another to will it, so we even say that he wills it, though he does not cause another to will it, but approves of his willing it. As, for example, when we see anyone willing bravely to endure injury in order to accomplish some good purpose, although we confess that we are willing that he should endure that penalty, yet we do not wish or delight in his penalty, but his good will. If too a person can prevent a thing, and does not, we are accustomed to say that he wills what he does not prevent. Since then the will of the Son was pleasing to the Father, and he did not prevent him from willing or from doing what he willed, it is truly affirmed that he willed that the Son should endure a death which showed such piety, and was so beneficial, although he had no pleasure in the penalty he bore. Moreover, he said that the cup could not pass from him except he drank it, not because he could not avoid death if he would, but because, as has been said, it was impossible for the world to be saved in any other way, and he himself was unalterably determined rather to suffer death than that the world should not be saved. It was for this reason also that he said these words, that he might teach the human race that they could not be saved in any other way than by his death, but not to show that he had no power at all to avoid death. For whatever things are said concerning him, like those which have been quoted, are to be so expounded that he may be believed to have died by no necessity, but by his own free will. For he was omnipotent, and it is written of him that he was offered because he himself willed it. Footnote, Isaiah 53 verse 7, Vulgate, end footnote. And he himself saith, I lay down my life, that I may take it again. No man taketh it from me, but I lay it down of myself. I have power to lay it down, and I have power to take it again. Since, therefore, he does this by his own power and will, he cannot rightly be said at all to be compelled to do it.
Only this fact, that God permits him to be thus treated, although unwilling, does not seem becoming for such a father in dealing with such a son.
Truly it is most becoming for such a father to consent to such a son, if he wills to do that which is praiseworthy for the honour of God and beneficial for the salvation of men, and which could not be done in any other way.
We are still engaged on this question. In what way can that death be shown to be reasonable and necessary? For otherwise it does not seem that the Son ought to have willed it, or the Father to have compelled, or even permitted it. For the question is, why God could not save man in another way, or, if he could, why he chose to save him in this way. For it not only seems unbefitting for God to save man in this way, but it is not clear of what avail that death is for the salvation of man. For it is a marvellous thing if God is so pleased with, or in such want of, the blood of an innocent person, that unless he is put to death he cannot or will not spare the guilty.
Since in this inquiry you represent those who will believe nothing unless the reason for it has been previously demonstrated, I will agree with you that we should not allow any, if the very least thing that is unbecoming on the part of God, and that no reason, not even of the slightest value, be set aside, unless a stronger one is opposed to it. For as there is a moral impossibility in the way of the least thing that is improper in God, so there is a necessity in admitting any, even the slightest reason for his conduct, unless it is refuted by a stronger reason.
There is nothing I more willingly agree to on this subject than that we keep to this compact.
Our inquiry is only respecting the incarnation of God, and those things we believe respecting his assuming human nature.
Just so.
Let us suppose, then, that the incarnation of God, and the things we say of him as man, had never taken place, and let it be agreed between us that man has been created for a blessedness which cannot be obtained in this life, and which no one can attain to except by the remission of his sins, and that no man passes through this life without sin, and other things, belief in which is necessary to eternal salvation.
Be it so. For in these things there seems nothing unbecoming or impossible to God.
The remission of sins is therefore necessary to man, that he may attain to blessedness.
So we all hold.
End of section 3. Section 4 of Cur Deus Homo by Anselm of Canterbury, translated by Edward S. Prout. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Book 1, chapters 11 to 15. We must inquire, therefore, for what reason God may remit sins to men. And that we may do this more clearly, let us first see what it is to sin, and what to make satisfaction for sin.
It is your place to explain, and mine to attend.
If an angel or a man had always rendered to God what was his due, he would never sin.
I cannot contradict that.
Is sin therefore anything else than not rendering to God what is his due?
What is it that is due which we owe to God?
The entire will of a rational creature ought to be subject to the will of God.
Nothing can be truer.
This is the debt which both angels and men owe to God. No one who pays this sins, but everyone who does not pay it does sin. This is the righteousness or rectitude of will which makes men righteous or right in heart, that is, in will. This is the sole and entire honor which we owe to God, and which God requires from us, for it is only such a will that makes our works pleasing to God when it can perform them, and when it cannot, the will of itself pleases him, since no work without it is pleasing. The man who does not render to God this honor which is his due takes away from God what is his own, and dishonors God, and this is to sin. Moreover, as long as he does not repay what he has stolen, he remains in fault, and it is not sufficient only to restore what has been taken away, but in return for the injury inflicted, he ought to restore more than he took away. For just as when one injures the health of another, it is not sufficient to restore his health, unless he gives some recompense for the injury inflicted by causing him suffering. So, when one wrongs another person's honor, it does not suffice to restore his honor, unless he gives back to the man whom he has dishonored something which may be pleasing to him, according to the extent of the injury caused by his dishonor. This too should be noticed, that when anyone repays what he unjustly took away, he ought to give something that could not be required of him if he had not stolen the property of another. In like manner, therefore, everyone who sins ought to render back to God the honor he has taken away, and this is the satisfaction which every sinner ought to make to God.
Since we have proposed to follow reason on all these points, though you a little alarm me, I have nothing to say against you.
Let us go back and see whether by mercy alone it is proper for God to remit sins without any payment for the honor taken away from him.
I do not see why it is not proper.
To remit sin in this way is the same as not to punish it. And since it is not possible to bring sin into accordance with right order without satisfaction being made, except by punishing it, if it is not punished, it is let go without being brought into due order.
Your remark is reasonable.
But it is not proper to remit any irregularity in his kingdom.
If I wished to contradict you, I should be afraid of sinning.
So that it is not proper for God to pass by sin thus unpunished.
That follows.
And there is another thing that follows, if sin is thus remitted unpunished, that God will treat in the same way him who sins and him who does not, a thing which is not befitting God.
I cannot deny it.
Look at this, too. No one is ignorant that the righteousness of men is under a law, so that the measure of reward recompensed to it by God will be according to its quantity.
So we believe.
But if sin is neither paid nor punished, it is subject to no law.
I cannot suppose it otherwise.
Therefore unrighteousness is more free than righteousness, if it is remitted by mercy alone, and this seems very incongruous. Nay more, this incongruity reaches even this point, that it makes unrighteousness like God. For as God is subject to no one's law, so too is unrighteousness.
I cannot resist your reasoning. But when God bids us altogether forgive those who sin against us, it seems a contradiction that he should bid us do what it is not proper for him to do.
There is no contradiction in this, because God bids us do this, that we may not take upon ourselves what belongs to God alone. For no one has right to take vengeance except he who is Lord of all. For when earthly rulers do this rightly, God himself does it, by whom they were appointed for this very purpose.
You have cleared up a contradiction which I thought existed. But there is another point on which I should like to have your answer. For since God is so free, he is subject to no law and to no one's judgment, and is yet so kind that nothing kinder can be conceived. And there is nothing right or proper but what he himself wills. It seems a strange thing if we say that he is not at all willing, or that it is not lawful for him to forgive injury done to himself, though we are accustomed to ask pardon from him, even for those injuries we do to others.
What you say about his freedom and his will and his kindness is true, but we ought to understand these truths in a reasonable manner, so as not to bring them into opposition to his dignity, for his liberty only extends to what is expedient or becoming, nor is that to be called kindness which affects anything unbecoming to God. But when it is said that what he wills is right, and what he does not will is not right, it is not to be understood that if God were to will anything unbecoming, it would be right because he willed it. For it does not follow that if God were to choose to lie, it would be right to lie, but rather that he who did so was not God. For a will cannot at all choose to lie unless truth has been corrupted in it, or rather has been itself corrupted by deserting truth. When therefore it is said, if God willed to lie, it is the same as saying if God were of such a nature as could be willing to lie, so that it does not follow that falsehood is right, unless it be understood as when we say of two impossible things, if this is, then that is, when neither this nor that is a fact. As, for example, if one should say, if water is dry, then fire is moist, for neither is true. So, too, it is only true to say, if God wills this, it is right, respecting those things which it is not unbefitting for God to will. For if God wills that it rain, it is right that it should rain, and if God wills that a man be slain, it is right for him to be slain. Wherefore, if it is not becoming to God to do anything unjustly or irregularly, it is not within the scope of his liberty or kindness or will to let go unpunished the sinner who does not repay to God what he has taken away.
You clear up all the objections which I thought could be urged against you.
See further why it is not becoming for God to do this.
I will gladly listen to what you say.
Nothing is less tolerable in the order of things than that the creature should take away from the Creator the honour due to him, and not repay what he takes away.
Nothing is clearer than this.
But nothing more unjust can be tolerated than a thing less tolerable than aught besides.
This, too, is plain enough.
I suppose, then, you will not say that God ought to tolerate a thing than which nothing more unjust is endured, viz., that the creature should not restore to God what he takes away.
I see that we ought by all means to deny that he can.
Again, if there is nothing greater or better than God, there is nothing more righteous than that highest righteousness which preserves his honour in the arrangement of things, and that is nothing else than God himself.
Nothing can be clearer than this, too.
There is nothing, therefore, that God preserves more justly than the honour of his own dignity.
I ought to grant this.
Does it seem to you that he will preserve it in its entirety if he permits it to be taken away from him in such a way that it is neither repaid, nor does he punish the person who took it away?
I dare not say he would.
It is necessary, therefore, that either the honor taken away be repaid, or punishment follow. Otherwise, either God will be unjust to himself, or he will be powerless to secure either alternative, a thing it is wicked even to imagine.
I think that nothing more reasonable can be said. But I wish to hear from you if the punishment of the sinner is an honor to God, or what kind of honor it is. For if the punishment of the sinner be not for his honor, when the sinner does not pay what he took away, but is punished instead, God loses his own honor so as not to recover it, and this seems to be opposed to what has been said.
It is impossible for God to lose his own honor, for either the sinner pays of his own accord what he owes, or God takes it from him against his will. For either man of his own free will shows the subjection he owes to God by not sinning, or by making satisfaction for sin, or else God subdues him, though unwilling, by tormenting him, and thus shows that he is his Lord, a truth this same man refuses of his own free will to confess. And on this point we must reflect that as man by sinning steals what is God's, so God by punishing takes away what is man's. For not only is that said to belong to a person which he already possesses, but which it is in his power to obtain. Since then man was made that he might obtain blessedness if he had not sinned, when on account of sin he is deprived of blessedness and of all good, he repays out of what is his own, though against his will, what he has stolen. For although God does not transfer what he takes away to be used for his own advantage, in the way that a man converts to his own use money he has taken from another, yet what he takes away serves the purpose of his own honor by the very fact that he does take it away, for by doing so he proves that the sinner and all that is his are in subjection to himself.
I am pleased with what you say. But there is another thing also to which I ask your answer. For if God ought in this way, as you prove, to preserve his own honor, why does he allow it, even to a slight extent, to be violated? For the fact that it is allowed in any way to be violated shows that it is not kept in its entirety and perfection.
Nothing can be added to or taken away from the honor of God absolutely. For this honor, like himself, is incorruptible and in no way liable to change. But when any creature keeps his own appointed rank, whether by nature or reason, he is said to obey God and to honor him. And this is especially the case with a rational creature to whom the power has been given of understanding what he owes. And when the creature wills to give what he owes, he honors God, not because he confers anything on God, but because he voluntarily submits himself to his will and disposal, and preserves his own rank in the universe, and the beauty of that universe so far as it is in his power. But when he does not will to give what is due, so far as he is concerned, he dishonors God, for he does not voluntarily submit himself to his disposal, but, as far as lies in his power, disturbs the order and beauty of the universe, though he cannot at all injure or stain the power and dignity of God. For if those things which are contained in the circuit of heaven willed not to be under, or to be further removed away from heaven, they could not by any means be elsewhere than under heaven, nor could they escape from heaven except by approaching heaven. For wherever they came from or went to, or in whatever way they went, they are still under heaven, and the farther they are removed from any given part of heaven, the nearer they are to the opposite part. So, although a man or a wicked angel is unwilling to be subject to the divine will and ordination, he has no power to escape from it, for if he wills to escape from the will that commands him, he falls into the power of the will that punishes him. And if you ask how he makes the change, it is only under the will of him who permits it. And supreme wisdom changes this very perverse willing or acting into a means of promoting the order and beauty of the before-mentioned universe, for the spontaneous satisfaction for wrong that has been done, or the exaction of punishment from him who will not give satisfaction, it being expressly stated that God brings good out of evil in many ways. These both hold their own place in the same universe and preserve the beauty of its order. And if, when wrongdoing strives to disturb the right order of things, divine wisdom did not annex these conditions in the very universe which God ought to regulate, there would be a certain uncomeliness arising from the beauty of order being violated, and God would seem to fail in his own arrangements. And as both these things are unseemly, they are impossible, so that it is necessary that satisfaction or punishment follow every sin.
You have satisfactorily met my objection.
It is plain, therefore, that no one can honor or dishonor God, as he is in himself, but anyone seems to do it, as far as it is in his power when he submits or withholds his will from the will of God.
I do not know that I can say anything against this.
I will add something further.
Pray continue speaking till I am tired of listening.
End of section 4. Section 5 of Cor Deus Homo by Anselm of Canterbury, translated by Edward S. Prout. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Book 1, chapters 16 to 20. It is certain that God planned to restore from human nature, which he made without sin, the number of the angels who had fallen.
We believe this, but I should like to have some reason for this fact.
You are overreaching me, for we did not propose to deal with any question but the incarnation of God, and you are interposing other questions before me.
Do not be angry, for God loveth a cheerful giver. For no one gives a better proof that he gives cheerfully what he promises, than he who gives more than he promises. Tell me, therefore, freely what I ask.
We must not doubt that it was foreknown by God that the rational nature, which either is or is about to be blessed by the contemplation of God, should consist of a certain reasonable and perfect number, so that it is not proper for it to be either more or less. For either God does not know of what number it would be best for it to be formed, a supposition which is false, or, if he knows it, he will form it of that number which he understands to be more fit for his purpose. Wherefore those angels who fell were either made so as to be within that number, or because they were beyond that number, they could not continue to stand, but fell of necessity, a supposition which is absurd.
What you say is simple truth.
Since then they ought to be of that number, either the number of them must necessarily be restored, or rational nature will remain imperfect in number, though it was foreknown that it would exist in a perfect number, which cannot be.
Undoubtedly they must be restored.
It is necessary, therefore, that they be restored from human nature, since there is no other form which they can be.
Why cannot these angels themselves be restored, or others in their place?
When you see the difficulty of our restoration, you will see the impossibility of their reconciliation. Moreover, other angels cannot be put in their place, not to speak of how opposed this would seem to be to the perfection of the first creation, because they ought not to be, unless they could be in such circumstances as the first angels would have been if they had not sinned. For those first angels would have persevered when no retribution on sin had been witnessed, a thing which after their fall was impossible to others which might be put in their place. For they cannot be equally praiseworthy, though standing in the truth, if the one knows of no punishment for sin and the other is always witnessing its eternal punishment. For it is by no means to be supposed that the good angels have been established in grace by the fall of the wicked angels, but by their own desert. For as the good, if they had sinned with the wicked, would have been condemned with them, so the unjust, if they had stood with the just, would have been equally established. For if some of them were to be established only by the fall of others, either no one of them would ever have been established, or it was necessary that someone should fall and be punished for the establishment of the rest, both which suppositions are absurd, so that those who stood have been established in the way in which all would have been established if they had stood. What this way was, I have pointed out to the best of my ability when I discussed why God did not give the grace of perseverance to the devil.
You have proved that the wicked angels are to be replaced from human nature, and it is clear from this reasoning that elect men will not be less in number than the reprobate angels. But show, if you can, whether they will be more in number.
If the angels, before any of them fell, were of that perfect number of which we have spoken, men have only been made to take the place of the lost angels, and it is clear that they are not more in number than those were. But if that number were not found in all those angels together, both the number that perished and the number that was before lacking must be filled up from men, and there will be more elect men than reprobate angels. And so we will say that men were created not only for restoring the diminished number, but for perfecting the yet imperfect number.
Which view should we rather hold, that the angels were first made perfect in number, or not?
I will tell you what seems to me to be the truth.
I cannot require more from you.
If man was made after the fall of the wicked angels, as some suppose from the book of Genesis, I do not see that I can, from this, prove either of these points certainly, for it may be, as I suppose, that the angels first formed a perfect number, and man was afterwards made for restoring their diminished number, or it may be that they were not perfect in number, because God, being about to create human nature in his own time, delayed, as he still delays, completing that number. Whence it follows either that he would merely make up the number that was not yet complete, or even if it were diminished, would restore it. But if the whole creation was made at once, and those days in which Moses seems to say that this world of ours was not made at once are to be understood in a different way from the days we know of and in which we live, then I cannot understand how the number of angels were made of that perfect number. Because if it were so, it seems to me a necessary consequence either that some men or angels were destined to fall, or there would be more in that celestial state than the appropriateness of the perfect number required. If therefore all things were made at once, the angels and the two first human beings seem to have been so far imperfect in number, that if no angel had fallen, only the number that was wanting would have been made up by men, and if any perished, the number that fell would be restored. Moreover, human nature, which was weaker, would, as it were, vindicate God, and confound the devil, should he impute his fall to his own weakness, since man's weaker nature stood. And even if the same human nature fell, much more would it justify God against the devil and against itself, inasmuch as though made far weaker and subject to death, it would, in the persons of the elect, rise from such great weakness, so much higher than the state from whence the devil had fallen, even as far as the good angels, equality with whom is due to it, had attained to after the ruin of the wicked angels, because they had persevered. For these reasons it seems to me more probable that the angels did not form that perfect number by which the celestial state should be made complete. For if man was not made at the same time as the angels, it is possible this may be the case, and if they were made at the same time, as many rather suppose, because it is written, He who liveth for ever created all things together. It seems to be necessarily the case, but if the perfection of the earthly creation is not to be sought so much in the number of individuals as in the number of natures, it is necessary either that human nature was made for the completion of that perfection, or that it is superfluous, a thing we dare not say respecting the nature of the tiniest worm. Wherefore human nature was made for its own account, and not only to restore the number of the individuals of another nature. Hence it is clear that even if no angel had perished, men would have had their place in the celestial state. It follows, therefore, that among the angels, before any one of them had sinned, that perfect number did not exist. Otherwise it was necessary that either men or angels should fall, since beyond that perfect number no one could remain there.
You have established something.
There is another reason also, as it seems to me, which in no small degree supports the opinion that angels were not created of that perfect number.
Tell me what it is.
If the angels were made of that perfect number, and men had not been made at all, except to take the place of the lost angels, it is plain that unless some angels had fallen from their state of blessedness, men would not have risen to it.
That is certain.
If indeed anyone should say that in that case elect men will exult as much at the perdition of the angels as they will rejoice at their own exaltation, since without doubt the one would not have taken place without the other, how can they be cleared from this unhallowed joy? Or how shall we say that the angels which fell were replaced from among men? For those angels, if they had not fallen, would have remained free from this fault, viz., joy over the fall of others. But those angels who take their place cannot be free from that fault. How indeed will they have any right to be blessed with this fault upon them? How audacious then it would be to say that God is not willing, or is not able, to effect this restoration without this fault.
Have we not a similar case in the Gentiles, who were called to the faith because the Jews rejected it?
No, for if all the Jews had believed, the Gentiles would yet have been called, because in every nation he that feareth God and worketh righteousness is accepted with him. But because the Jews spurned the apostles, that was the occasion of their turning to the Gentiles.
I see no way of answering your argument.
From what do you think that extraordinary joy over the fall of another seems to arise?
From whence can it, unless that one will be certain that he will be where he would not otherwise have been, unless someone had fallen from that place?
If therefore no one had this certainty, there would be no loss for anyone rejoicing over another's loss.
So it seems.
Do you think that any one of those elect men will have this certainty, if they will be many more in number than those angels who fell?
I cannot at all imagine that he would or ought to be able to have this certainty, for how could anyone know whether he had been made for restoring what had been lost, or for completing what was not yet perfect in the number of the state that was to be established? but all will know that they were made for the purpose of completing that state.
If, therefore, they will be more numerous than the reprobate angels, no one will have the power or the right of knowing that he was only exalted thither on account of another's fall.
True.
No one, therefore, will have any reason for rejoicing in the perdition of another.
That follows.
Since then we see that if there will be more elect men than there are reprobate angels, that incongruity need not follow, which must follow if there will not be more. And since it is impossible there will be any incongruity in that state, it seems necessary that angels were not made of that perfect number, and that there will be more blessed men than miserable angels.
I do not see in what way this can be denied.
I think another reason for this opinion can be named.
You ought to bring this forward, too.
We believe that this material mass of the world is to be renewed in some better form, that this will not take place until the number of elect men is completed, and that blessed state is perfected, but that it will not be postponed beyond its perfection. Whence we may gather that God planned from the beginning that he would perfect both together, so that the inferior nature, which could not perceive God, should by no means be perfected before the superior, which ought to enjoy God, and yet in the perfection of the superior nature, itself changed for the better, should, as it were, in its own way share the joy. Indeed, every creature, as the result of so glorious and admirable a consummation, by rejoicing forever together, each in its own way, would delight in its Creator, and in itself by turns, so that what the will does of its own accord in the rational creature, even the irrational creature should naturally also do by God's own arrangement. For we are wont to rejoice together at the exaltation of our ancestors, as when on the birthdays of the saints we take pleasure in a festive celebration, rejoicing in their glory. And the following thought seems to support this opinion, viz. That if Adam had not sinned, God would nevertheless have postponed the perfecting of that state until the number which he was waiting for, having been completed from among men, these men themselves would have been transferred into, so to speak, an immortal immortality of body. For granted that they had in paradise a kind of immortality, that is, the power of not dying, yet since it was possible to die, this was not the prerogative of immortality, by virtue of which they could not die. But if it is a fact that God from the beginning designed to perfect at the same time that rational and blessed state, and this worldly and irrational nature, it seems to follow either that that state was not complete in the number of the angels before the fall of the wicked angels, but that God was waiting to complete it from men, when he should change for the better the material nature of this world, or that if it was perfect in number, it was not perfect in its establishment in grace, but that this establishment must be put off, even if no one in it had sinned, until that renewal of the world which we are looking for, or else that if this establishment could not be put off any longer, the renewal of the world must be hastened on, that it might take place at the same time as that establishment. But it is quite unreasonable to believe that God determined to renew the world which had been newly made, and at the very beginning to destroy those things which will not exist after that renewal, before it appeared why they had been made. It follows, therefore, that the angels were not of a perfect number, so that their establishment in grace could be no longer postponed, since it would then have been needful that the renewal of the new world should immediately take place, a thing which is not suitable, but that God should have wished to put off this establishment till the future renewal of the world seems incongruous, especially since he accomplished it in some so quickly, and since it can be seen that in the case of our first parents, at the time of their sin, he would have established them if they had not sinned, as he did in the case of the angels that persevered, although, however, they would not have been advanced to that equality with angels to which men were destined to arrive when the number to be taken among them was perfected. But being in that state of righteousness in which they were, it seems that if, when tempted, they had overcome so as not to sin, they would have been so established in grace with all their posterity that they could not have sinned any more. Whereas, since they were overcome and sinned, they were so weakened that of themselves they could not exist without sin. For who dares to say that unrighteousness has more power to bind a man in servitude when he consents to sin at its first overture, than righteousness would have had to confirm him in liberty if he clave to it at the same first temptation? For just as since entire human nature was in our first parents, it was all conquered in them, so that it sinned, with the exception of that one man whom, as God knew how to make from a virgin without man's seed, he also knew how to separate from the sin of Adam. So the whole of human nature would have conquered in them if they had not sinned. It follows, therefore, that The celestial state was not completed in the original number of angels, but may be said to be destined to be completed from among men. And on this supposition there will be more elect men than reprobate angels.
What you say seems very reasonable to me. But what shall we say is meant when it is said of God, "He set the bounds of the peoples according to the number of the children of Israel"? And since the reading is found "angels of God" instead of "children of Israel," some expound that the number of elect men to be taken up is to be understood to correspond to the number of the good angels.
This is not opposed to the opinion given before, since it is not certain that as many angels fell as stood. For if there were more elect men than reprobate angels, and it is necessary that elect men replace the reprobate angels, it is also possible that they may be made equal in number to the blessed angels, and thus there will be more righteous men than wicked angels. But remember on what terms I began to answer your inquiry, viz., that if I say anything which a higher authority does not confirm, it is to be received with no further certainty than as what in the meanwhile seems true to me, until God in some way reveals something better. For I am certain that if I say anything that is undoubtedly opposed to Holy Scripture, it is false, and I do not wish to hold it if I am aware of it. But if on these subjects on which there may be differences of judgment without peril, as is the case with that we are now discussing, for if we do not know whether or not more men are to be elected than angels lost, and we think one of these views more probable than the other, I consider there is no peril to the soul. If I say, in matters of this kind, we so expound the word of God that it seems to favour different opinions, and no other place is found in the Scriptures which undoubtedly decides what should be held, I do not think we ought to be blamed. But as to that passage which you quoted, he sets the bounds of the peoples, or nations, according to the number of the angels of God, which in another translation is read according to the number of the sons of Israel, since both translations either mean the same or different things which are not contradictory. It is to be so understood that by the angels of God and by the sons of men only the good angels are meant, or elect men alone, or both angels and elect men, i.e., the whole of that celestial state. Or by the angels of God holy angels only, or by the sons of Israel just men alone, or angels alone by the sons of Israel, and just men by the angels of God. If good angels only are meant by both terms, that is the same as if only the expression angels of God were used. But if the whole celestial state is meant, the meaning is this, that nations, i.e., multitudes of elect men, will be taken into it, or there will be nations in this world for so long a time until the predestined number of that state, which is not yet perfect, is completed from among men. But I do not see at present how angels only, or both angels and holy men, are to be understood by the sons of Israel. But it is not strange that holy men should be called sons of Israel, as well as sons of Abraham, and they may also be rightly called angels of God, because they imitate the life of angels, and likeness to angels and equality with them are promised them in heaven, and because all who live righteously are God's angels. Whence also confessors and martyrs are so called, for he who confesses and witnesses to the truth is God's messenger, i.e., his angel. And if a wicked man is called a devil, as our Lord says of Judas, on account of his likeness in wickedness, why shall not a good man also be called an angel on account of his likeness in righteousness? Therefore we can, I think, say that God set the bounds of the nations according to the number of elect men, because nations will exist, and the procreation of men in this world will continue until the number of those elect men is completed, and when completed the generation of men which takes place in this life will cease. Or if by the angels of God we understand the holy angels only, and by the sons of Israel only righteous men, the words God set the bounds of the nations according to the number of the angels of God may be understood in two ways. Either that so great a nation, i.e., so many men, will be taken in as there are holy angels of God, or that nations will continue to exist until the number of the angels of God is completed from among men. And I think we can only explain in one way the words, he set the bounds of the nations according to the number of the sons of Israel, viz., that, as has been said before, nations will continue to exist in this world until the number of holy men is taken in, and we gather from both translations that as many men will be taken in as there were angels that stood. But it does not follow from this that although the lost angels are to be replaced from among men, as many angels fell as persevered. But if this is asserted, it must be shown how the reasons given above are not valid, which seems to prove that the perfect number, which I have spoken of above, did not exist among the angels before some of them fell, and that there will be more elect men than wicked angels.
I do not repent that I compelled you to say these things respecting the angels, for it has not been in vain. But now return to the point from which we made a digression.
It is certain, then, that God purposed to replace from among men the angels who had fallen.
That is certain.
It is needful, therefore, that the men who will be taken into that celestial state in the place of the angels be in the same state as those would have been in whose place they will stand, i.e., as the good angels now are. Otherwise, those who fell will not be replaced. And it will follow either that God will not be able to perfect the good work which he began, or that he will repent that he began so great a good work, both of which suppositions are absurd.
It is indeed needful that men be equal to the good angels.
Have the good angels ever sinned?
No.
Can you conceive that a man who has once sinned and has never made satisfaction to God for his sin, but was simply let go unpunished, can be equal to an angel who has never sinned?
I can conceive and utter the words you have used, but I can no more conceive them to be true than I can suppose falsehoods to be true.
It is not proper, then, for God, without satisfaction, to take sinful men to replace lost angels, since truth does not suffer him to be raised to an equality with the good angels.
So reason proves.
Consider also in regard to man alone, not to speak of his being made equal to the angels, whether God ought to advance him to any blessedness, or at any rate to such as he had before he sinned.
Tell me what you think, and I will consider it to the best of my ability.
Let us suppose a wealthy man holds in his hand a precious pearl which no pollution has ever touched, and which no one else can take out of his hand without his permission, and that he determines to lay it up in his treasury, where are his most cherished and costly possessions.
I conceive this as though it were before our very eyes.
What if he himself allows this pearl to be shaken out of his hand into the mud by some envious person, when he could have prevented it, and then afterwards taking it up from the mire, filthy and unwashed, he lays it up in some pure and costly receptacle, intending henceforth to keep it in that state? Would you think him a wise man?
How could I? For would it not be far better to retain and preserve this pearl pure than polluted?
Would not God act in the same way, who kept man in paradise as his own hand, destined to be associated with angels without sin, and yet permitted the devil, inflamed by envy, to cast him down, though with man's own consent, into the mire of sin? For if he had chosen to prevent the devil, he could not have tempted man. Would he not, I say, act in a similar manner, if, when man was stained with the filth of sin, without any cleansing, that is, without any satisfaction, he should bring him back at all events into the paradise from which he had been expelled, always to remain there just as he was?
I dare not deny the resemblance, if God were to do this, and therefore I do not grant that he can do it. For it would seem that either God could not accomplish what he purposed, or that he repented of his good plan, and neither of these things can happen to God.
Regard it therefore as most certain that without satisfaction, i.e., without a willing payment of what is due, neither can God let sin pass unpunished, nor can the sinner attain even to such blessedness as he had before he sinned. For man would not in this way be restored to such a position as he had before he sinned.
I cannot at all contradict your reasoning. But how is it that we say to God, "Forgive us our debts," and every nation prays to the God in whom it believes, that he would forgive their sins? For if we pay what we owe, why do we pray him to forgive? For is God unjust to demand again what has been paid? But if we do not pay, why do we pray in vain that he would do what he cannot, because he ought not?
He who doth not pay says in vain, "Forgive," but he who pays asks for pardon. For the very fact that we ask is part of the payment. For God is not in debt to any man, but every creature is in debt to him. And so it is not proper for a man to deal with God as an equal with an equal. But it is not needful now to answer on this point, for when we learn why Christ died, perhaps you will see for yourself what you are asking.
Your answer on this question suffices me for the present. But that no man can attain to blessedness while in sin, or be loosed from sin, unless he repays what he has stolen by sinning, you have so clearly proved, that I could not doubt it, even if I wished to.
I suppose you will not doubt this too, that satisfaction must be made according to the measure of sin.
Otherwise sin would remain, to a certain extent, not subject to law, which cannot be. For God leaves nothing beyond control in his kingdom. But it has been already settled that the slightest inconsistency in God is impossible.
Tell me then, what will you pay to God for your sin?
Repentance, a contrite heart, humility, fastings and many kinds of bodily labors, mercy in giving and forgiving, and obedience.
In all these things, what do you give to God?
Do not I honor God when, because of the fear and love of Him, in the contrition of my heart I reject the joy of this world? By fastings and labors I trample on the delights and repose of this life. By giving and forgiving what is due to me, I freely spend my substance. By obedience I subject myself to Him.
When you render anything which you owe to God, even if you have not sinned, you ought not to reckon this as a debt which you owe on account of sin. But all these things which you mention, you do owe to God, for there ought to be in this mortal life such great love as this, and also, for which prayer is appropriate, a longing to attain to the end for which you were created, and a grief that you have not yet reached it, and a fear lest you should not attain to it, so that you ought to feel no real pleasure except in regard to those things which are either a help to you, or give you the hope of attaining. For you do not deserve to have what you do not love and long for in proportion to its real worth, and respecting which you do not grieve that you have not yet obtained it, and are still in such uncertainty as to whether you will gain it or not. And for this object it is your place to flee repose and worldly pleasures, which draw off the mind from the true repose and pleasure, except so far as you learn that they serve to promote your purpose of attaining that end. As to what you give, you ought to consider it as part of what you owe, since you know that what you give you obtain not from yourself, but from Him whose servants both you and He to whom you give are. Nature itself also teaches you that you should do to your fellow servant, man to man, as you wish to be done to by him, and that he who is not willing to give what he has ought not to receive what he has not. As to forgiveness, I speak quite briefly, because vengeance does not at all belong to you, as we said above, since neither art thou thine own, nor is he who did thee wrong thine own or his own, but you are servants of one Lord, made by him out of nothing. And if you take vengeance on your fellow servant, you proudly claim over him a power of judgment which belongs to the Lord, the judge of all. And when you render obedience, what do you give to God that you do not owe to him, to whose command you owe all that you are and have and can become?
I dare not now say that in all these things I give to God anything I do not owe.
What therefore will you pay to God for your sin?
If I owe to Him myself and all I can give, even when I do not sin, lest I should sin, I have nothing to render to Him in compensation for sin.
What then will become of you? In what way can you be saved?
If I think over your reasonings, I do not see how. But if I have recourse to my belief in the Christian faith, which worketh by love, I hope it is possible for me to be saved, because we read that if the unrighteous man is turned from his unrighteousness, and doeth righteousness, all his unrighteousnesses shall be forgotten.
This is only said to those who either looked for Christ before he came or believed in him after he came. But we have been regarding Christ and the Christian faith as though he did not exist, for we have purposed to inquire by reason alone whether his advent was necessary for the salvation of men.
So we did.
Let us proceed therefore by pure reason.
Although you lead me into some difficulties, still I very much wish you to advance as you began.
End of section 5. Section 6 of Cur Deus Homo by Anselm of Canterbury, translated by Edward S. Prout. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Book 1, chapters 21 to 25. Let us grant that you do not already owe all those things which you just now declared you are able to pay for your sin, and let us see if they can suffice as satisfactions for a single sin, however small, as for example, a single look in opposition to the will of God.
Except that I hear you bring this into question, I should suppose that I blotted out this sin by one single pang of sorrow for it.
Have you not yet considered what a heavy weight sin is?
Pray show it to me now.
If you were to see yourself in the presence of God, and someone should say to you, "Look thither," and God, on the other hand, were to say, "I wish you on no account to look," Ask now in your own heart, what is there in all things that exist for the sake of which you ought to take that look, contrary to the will of God?
I know of no reason why I ought to take that look, unless I were perchance placed under the necessity of committing either this or some greater sin.
Put that necessity out of the case, and consider in regard to that sin alone whether you might do it even for your own redemption.
I see clearly that I cannot.
Not to detain you too long, what if it were necessary either that the whole world and all that is not God perish and be reduced to nothing, or that you should do so slight an act against the will of God?
When I think of the act itself, I see that it is a very trifling one. But when I look at what it is in opposition to the will of God, I perceive that it is exceedingly grave, and not to be compared with any loss that might be sustained. But we are wont sometimes to do a thing against the will of someone, yet without blame, that his property may be preserved. And we do against his will what afterwards he is pleased with.
This is done for a man who sometimes does not understand what is for his advantage, or who cannot restore what he has lost. But God is in need of no one, and could restore all things were they to perish, just as he made them.
I must confess that in order to preserve the whole creation, I ought not to do anything against the will of God.
What if there were more worlds full of creatures as this is?
If they were infinitely multiplied and were placed before me in like manner, I should give the same answer.
You can do nothing better. But suppose it happened that you did take that look against the will of God, what could pay for that sin?
I have nothing more than I have said above.
Thus seriously do we sin whenever we knowingly do anything, however slight, against the will of God, for we are always in his sight, and he is always bidding us not to sin.
As I understand, we live in an exceedingly dangerous condition.
It is clear that God requires satisfaction according to the amount of sin.
I cannot deny it.
You do not therefore make satisfaction unless you return something greater than that for the sake of which you were under obligation not to have committed the sin. Footnote, i.e., something greater than the penalty attached to the sin in footnote.
I see that reason requires it, and yet that is not altogether impossible.
Neither can God take to a state of blessedness anyone bound to any extent by the debt of sin because he ought not.
This decision is exceedingly serious.
Here yet another reason why it is not less difficult for man to be reconciled to God.
Unless faith give me comfort, this reason alone would make me despair.
Nevertheless, listen.
Say on.
Man, created in paradise without sin, was as it were placed there for God, between God and the devil, that he might overcome the devil by not consenting to his persuasives to sin, for the vindication and honour of God, and for the confusion of the devil. For then man, though weaker in nature, would on earth have abstained from sin, though urged to it by the devil himself, who, though stronger in nature, sinned in heaven, when no one urged him. And though man could easily have done this, and was coerced by no force, he allowed himself, by persuasion alone, to be voluntarily overcome, in accordance with the will of the devil, and against the will and honour of God.
What are you aiming at?
Judge for yourself, if it is not against the honour of God that man should be reconciled to him when he is still under the reproach of this wrong inflicted upon God, unless by overcoming the devil he first honoured God, as he had dishonoured him when he was overcome by the devil. Indeed, the victory ought to be of such a kind that, whereas, when strong and immortal in power, he easily yielded to the devil's persuasions of sin, and thus justly incurred the penalty of mortality, so now, though weak and mortal as he made himself to be, in spite of the difficulty caused by his mortality, he should overcome the devil, so that he may in no wise sin. And this he cannot do so long as, through the wound of the first sin, he is conceived and born in sin.
Again, I say that reason approves what you say, and that it is impossible.
Understand yet one other thing, without which man cannot be reconciled to God, which is no less impossible.
You have brought forward so many things which we ought to do, that whatever you add cannot alarm me more.
However, listen.
I listen.
What did man take away from God when he allowed himself to be overcome by the devil?
Tell me yourself as you have begun, for I do not see what one can add to those evils which you have pointed out.
Did he not take away from God whatever he had purposed to effect out of human nature?
It cannot be denied.
Think of the claims of strict justice, and judge by that whether man can make to God a satisfaction at all equal to his sin, unless by overcoming the devil he restores to God that very thing which he took away from him by permitting himself to be overcome by the devil. For thus, just as by the very fact that he was overcome, the devil stole what was God's and God lost it, so by the very fact that he overcomes, the devil loses it and God recovers it.
Nothing can be conceived more strict and just.
Do you think that supreme justice can violate this form of justice?
I dare not think so.
Man, therefore, neither can nor ought to receive from God what God proposed to give him, if he does not restore to God all that he took away, so that, as through him God lost, through him too God may recover what he lost. And this can only be done if, just as by being overcome, the whole of human nature was corrupted, and as it were leavened by sin, and God takes no one infected by sin for completing that celestial state, so by overcoming, as many men should be justified from sin as would fill up that number for the completion of which man was created. But man, the sinner, can by no means do this, because one who is a sinner cannot justify another sinner.
Nothing is more just, and yet nothing is more impossible. But from all these facts the mercy of God and the hope of man seems clean gone, as far as regards the blessedness for which man was created.
Yet wait a little.
What have you to say more?
If a man is called unjust who does not restore what he owes to man, much more is he unjust who does not restore what he owes to God.
If he can restore it and does not, he is unjust indeed. But if he cannot, how is he unjust?
Perhaps if no cause for his inability is found in himself, he may be excused to a certain extent. But if that very inability is to be blamed, as it does not palliate the sin, it does not excuse his not repaying the debt. For if anyone orders his servant to do a certain task, and charges him not to let himself fall into a pit which he points out to him, from which he cannot in any way get out, and that servant, neglecting the command and caution of his master, of his own accord lets himself fall into that pit which has been pointed out to him, so that it is impossible for him to accomplish his appointed task, do you suppose that his inability would serve as any excuse for not performing that appointed task?
By no means. But it rather increases his fault, because he himself caused his inability. For he committed a double sin, because he did not do the work he was ordered to, and what he was charged not to do, he did.
Just as inexcusable is man, who of his own accord has incurred that debt which he cannot pay, and by his own fault involved himself in his present inability, so that he can pay neither what he owed to God before sin, viz., to abstain from sin, nor what he now owes on account of his sin. In fact, his very inability is his fault, for he had no right to incur it. Nay, more, he was bound not to incur it. For as it is a fault not to have what one ought to have, so it is a fault to have what one ought not to have. As therefore it is man's own fault not to have that power which he received that he might shun sin, so it is his fault to have that inability by which he can neither retain righteousness and shun sin, nor restore what he owes for sin. But of his own accord he did that by which he lost his power and incurred his inability, for it is the same thing not to have the power which he ought to have, and to have the inability which he ought not to have. Wherefore the inability to repay God what he owes, and which is the cause of his not repaying it, does not excuse man, if he does not repay, since the result of sin does not excuse the sin which produces that result.
It is an exceedingly serious thing, and yet it must be so.
The man, then, who does not repay God what he owes is unjust.
That is but too true, for he is unjust because he does not repay, and unjust because he cannot.
But no unjust person will be admitted to blessedness, for as blessedness is a state of sufficiency in which there is no want, it is suitable only for him in whom righteousness is so pure that there is no unrighteousness in him.
I dare not believe otherwise.
The man, therefore, who does not pay to God what he owes cannot be blessed.
I cannot deny that this, too, follows.
But if you choose to say that the merciful God forgives the suppliant what he owes for the very reason that he cannot repay it, he can only be said to forgive one of two things: either what man ought freely to repay but cannot, i.e. something which may serve as a recompense for the sin which ought not to have been committed, even for the sake of preserving everything which is not God, or else that punishment which, as I said above, he was about to inflict upon man against his will by depriving him of blessedness. But if he forgives what a man ought freely to restore to God because he cannot restore it, what else is this but that God remits what he cannot get? But it is a mockery to attribute that kind of mercy to God. And if he remits what he was about to take away against man's will on account of his inability to restore what he ought of his own accord to repay, God relaxes punishment and makes a man blessed on account of sin, viz., because he has what he ought not to have. For he ought not to have that inability, and therefore, as long as he retains it without making satisfaction, it is his sin. But this kind of mercy in God is utterly opposed to his justice, which permits nothing but punishment to be returned for sin. Wherefore, as it is impossible to be in opposition to himself, it is also impossible for him to be merciful in this way.
I see that another kind of mercy than that must be sought.
But suppose it were true, God pardons him who does not repay what he owes because he cannot.
I could wish it were so.
But as long as he does not repay it, either he will wish to repay or he will not. But if he wishes to do what he cannot, he will be helpless. If, however, he does not wish to do it, he will be unjust.
Nothing is clearer than this.
But whether helpless or unjust, he will not be blessed.
This too is plain.
As long, therefore, as he does not repay, he cannot be blessed.
If God follows the method of justice, there is no way in which poor wretched man can escape, and God's mercy seems to be at an end.
You have demanded reason. Accept reason. I do not deny that God is merciful, who preserveth man and beast, even as he hath multiplied his mercy. But we are speaking of that final mercy by which, after this life, he makes man blessed. And I think I have sufficiently shown by the reasons given above, that this blessedness ought not to be given to anyone but to him whose sins are thoroughly forgiven, and that this forgiveness ought not to be granted except when the debt is paid which is due for sin, according to its exceeding greatness. But if you think that any objection can be taken to these arguments, you ought to say so.
I, at any rate, do not see that any of your arguments can be invalidated.
Nor do I think they can be if they are well considered. Yet, if only one of all I have advanced is confirmed by unquestionable truth, it ought to suffice. For whether a truth is unquestionably proved by only one argument or by more, it is equally secured against doubt.
Indeed it is so. How then is man to be saved, if he himself does not pay what he owes, and yet ought not to be saved if he does not pay? Or with what face shall we assert that God, who is rich in mercy above man's thought, cannot perform this act of mercy?
You ought now to require those in whose place you speak, who do not believe that Christ is necessary for the salvation of man, to tell us in what way man can be saved without Christ. But if they cannot in any way do this, let them cease to deride us, and come over and join us who have no doubt that man is saved by means of Christ, or else let them despair of salvation being effected in any way at all. If they shrink from this, let them believe with us in Christ, that they may be saved.
I will ask you, as I began, to show me in what way man is saved by Christ.
Is it not clearly enough proved that man can be saved by Christ, since even unbelievers do not deny that man may in some way be made blessed? And yet it has been sufficiently proved that if we assume that Christ does not exist, no way of salvation for man can be discovered by any means. For man can be saved either by Christ, or in some other way, or in no way at all. Wherefore, if it is false that he cannot be saved at all, or in some other way, it is necessary that he be saved by Christ.
If anyone, seeing the reason why man cannot be saved in any other way, and yet not understanding how he may be saved by Christ, should assert that he can be saved neither by Christ nor in any way at all, what shall we answer him?
What should be our answer to a man who asserts that a thing which is seen to be necessary is impossible, because he does not know how it can be?
That he is a fool.
So that what he says may be set at naught.
That is true. But we ought to prove to him in what way the thing is true which he thinks impossible.
Do you not understand from what we have said above, that it is necessary some men should attain to blessedness? For if it is inconsistent for God to bring man with any stain on him to that state for which he created him without any stain, lest he should seem either to repent of his good undertaking, or not to be able to fulfill his plan, much more impossible is it, on account of the same inconsistency, that no man at all should be promoted to that state for which he was created. Therefore either some satisfaction for sin must be found, apart from the Christian faith, such as we have shown above ought to be made, a thing which no reasoning can point out, or without hesitation it ought to be believed to exist in the Christian faith, for what we conclude to be undoubtedly true by necessary reasoning ought not to be brought into any uncertainty, although the reason why it is so is not clearly seen.
What you say is quite true.
What then do you ask further?
I did not come to you that you might remove any hesitation in my own faith, but that you might show me the reason for my certainty. Wherefore, as you have led me by reasoning to this point, that I see man the sinner owes to God, on account of sin, what he cannot repay, and unless he repays it he cannot be saved. So now I wish you to lead me on to the following point, viz., that I may understand, by necessary reasoning, how all those things must be true which the Catholic faith bids us believe respecting Christ, if we wish to be saved. Also the efficacy they have in the salvation of man, and in what way God saves man by his mercy, since he does not remit his sin unless he pays what he owes on account of it. And that your arguments may be the more certain, pray begin from first principles, so as to place them on a firm foundation.
May God help me now, for you show me no consideration, and do not take into account the weakness of my knowledge on which you impose so great a task. However, I will try, as I began, not relying on my own strength, but trusting in God, and with His help I will do what I can. But lest by excessive length we should weary anyone who wishes to read this, let us, in another introduction, distinguish what has been said from what is yet to be said. End of section 6. Section 7 of Cur Deus Homo by Anselm of Canterbury, translated by Edward S. Prout. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Book 2, Chapters 1 to 5. We ought not to doubt that rational nature was created righteous by God, that it might be blessed in the enjoyment of God. For it is rational for the very purpose of distinguishing between right and wrong, between good and evil, between greater good and less good, otherwise it would have been made rational to no purpose. But God did not make it rational in vain, so that there is no doubt it was for this end it was made rational. By similar reasoning it is proved that for the same end it received the power of judging, so that it might both hate and shun the evil, and love and choose the good, and might still more love and choose the greater good. For otherwise God gave it the power of discernment in vain, for it would discern in vain if it did not love and avoid according to its discernment. But it is improper to suppose that God would have given this power in vain. Therefore it is certain that the rational nature was created for this end, that it might love and choose the highest good above all things, not on account of something else, but on its own account. For if it loves it on account of something else, it loves that other thing, and not the good itself. But unless it is made righteous, it cannot do this. In order, therefore, that the rational nature should not be made in vain, it was made at the same time rational and righteous. Now, if it was made righteous, that it might choose and love the highest good, either it was made for the very purpose of attaining at some time what it loved, or it was not. But if it was not made righteous for the sake of attaining what it thus loves and chooses, it was made what it is in vain, nor is there any reason why it ought at some time to attain it. As long, therefore, as by loving and choosing the highest good it will do right, according to the end of its creation, it will be miserable because against its own will it will be in a state of need, through not gaining what it longs for, a supposition which is exceedingly absurd. Therefore rational nature has been created righteous, that it may be blessed in the enjoyment of the highest good, that is, God. It follows then that man, who is of a rational nature, was made righteous, that he might be blessed by the enjoyment of God. But that he was made of such a nature that he should not necessarily die is easily proved as follows, that, as we have already said, it is opposed to the wisdom and justice of God that he should compel man to suffer death without any fault, since he created him righteous for the purpose of enjoying eternal blessedness. It follows, therefore, that if he had never sinned, he would never have died. And from this a future resurrection of the dead at some time is clearly proved, for if man is to be perfectly restored, he ought to be restored to such a state as he would have been in if he had not sinned.
It cannot be otherwise.
Since, therefore, if man had not sinned, he would have been changed to a state of incorruption with the same body which he had, it is necessary that, when he is restored, he should be restored with his own body in which he is living in this life.
What shall we answer if anyone says that this ought to be so in those in whom the human race is to be restored, but that it is not necessary in the case of the reprobate?
Nothing can be conceived more just or proper than that, just as if man had persevered in righteousness, he would have been eternally blessed in his whole nature, i.e., in body and soul. So if he persists in unrighteousness, he should be altogether miserable forever.
You have satisfied me on these points in a very short time.
From these things it is easy to learn that in regard to human nature God will either complete what he began, or that he made in vain so sublime a nature capable of so great good. But if it is acknowledged that God made nothing more precious than a rational creature to rejoice in himself, it is exceedingly unlike him to permit any rational nature altogether to perish.
No rational mind can think otherwise.
It is needful, therefore, that, in regard to human nature, God should perfect what he begins. But, as we have said, this cannot be done except by a complete satisfaction for sin, which no sinner can make.
I see now that it is necessary God should complete what he begins, lest he seem to fail in his design in a way that is not fitting. But if this is so, it seems as if God was compelled by the necessity of avoiding what was unbefitting, to provide salvation for man. How then can it be denied that he does this more on his own account than on ours? And if so, what thanks do we owe him for what he does on his own account? How shall we even attribute our salvation to his grace, if it is of necessity he saves us?
There is a necessity which takes away or lessens obligation to the benefactor, and there is a necessity by which a greater obligation for the benefit is due. For if anyone confers a benefit by that necessity which he is subject to against his will, no gratitude, or at any rate a smaller amount, is due to him. But when, of his own accord, he brings himself under the necessity of conferring a benefit, and willingly endures it, then indeed he deserves more gratitude for his benefit. For this should not be called necessity, but grace, because he undertook or holds fast to his obligation, not by anyone's compulsion, but of his own free will. For if today you spontaneously promise that tomorrow you will give something, and on the morrow by the same free will give it, although you must either keep your promise, if you can, or lie, still the person to whom you give it is none the less indebted to you for your costly benefaction than if you had not promised it, since you are not forced to bring yourself under obligation to him before the time of actually bestowing the gift. Such is the case when anyone freely takes a vow to live the religious life, for although after such a vow he ought of necessity to keep it, lest he incur the condemnation of an apostate, and may even be forced to keep it if he is unwilling, yet if, of his own free will, he keeps what he has vowed, he is not less but more pleasing to God than if he had not vowed, for he has renounced for God's sake not only his ordinary life, but even the liberty he had of living such a life. And he ought not to be said to live the religious life of necessity, but by the same liberty with which he made the vow. Wherefore, much more if God completes for man some good which he begins, though it would not be becoming for him to fail in a good work he has begun, we ought to attribute the whole to free grace, because, although he was in need of nothing, he began it not on his own account, but on ours. For he was not ignorant of what man could do when he created him, and yet by creating him of his own goodness, he, of his own accord, as it were, bound himself to complete the good work he had begun. In fine, God does nothing by necessity, because he is in no way forced to do or prevented from doing anything. And when we say that God does anything, as it were, from the necessity of avoiding dishonour, which, however, there is not the slightest fear of his doing, we must rather understand that he does this from the necessity of preserving his honour, which necessity is clearly nothing but his own immutable honour, which he has from himself, and not from another, so that it is not properly called necessity. Let us, however, say that on account of God's unchangeableness, it is necessary that his goodness bring to perfection in man what he has begun, although all the good that he does is of grace.
I grant it.
End of section 7. Section 8 of Cur Deus Homo by Anselm of Canterbury, translated by Edward S. Prout. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Book 2, chapters 6 to 10. But this good cannot be accomplished unless there be someone to pay to God in compensation for the sin of man something greater than everything that exists except God.
That is certain.
It is needful, too, that he who can give to God of his own something of more value than everything which is below God must himself be greater than all that is not God.
I cannot deny it.
But there is nothing above all that is not God except God himself.
True.
There is no one, therefore, who can make this satisfaction except God himself.
That follows.
But no one ought to make it except man, otherwise man does not make satisfaction.
Nothing seems juster than this.
If therefore, as is certain, it is needful that that heavenly state be perfected from among men, and this cannot be unless the above-mentioned satisfaction be made, which no one can make except God, and no one ought to make except man, it is necessary that one who is God-man should make it.
Blessed be God! Already we have discovered one great truth on the subject of our inquiry. Go on, therefore, as you have begun, for I hope that God will help us.
We must inquire now in what way God can be made man. Now the divine and human natures cannot be interchanged, so that the divine should become human, or the human divine. Nor can they be so mingled that of the two natures some third nature be the result, which is neither altogether divine nor altogether human. In fine, if it could be that one nature should be changed into the other, the person would be only God and not man, or only man and not God. Or if they were mingled so that from two natures combined together some third nature should be formed, as from two individual animals of different species, male and female, a third is born, which does not preserve the entire nature of either father or mother, but a combination of both, he would be neither man nor God. The man-God, whom we are seeking, cannot therefore be made from divine and human nature, either by the conversion of one into another, or by the debased mingling of both into a third, because these things cannot be done, or if they could be, they would avail nothing for the object we have in view. But if in any way these two natures are said to be so united in their entirety that, though one is man and the other is God, yet the same person is not man who is God, it is impossible that both should do what is needful to be done. For God will not do it because he ought not, and man will not do it because he cannot. In order, then, that the God-man may do it, it is needful that the very same person who is to make this satisfaction be perfect God and perfect man, since no one can do it except one who is truly God, and no one ought to do it except one who is truly man. Since therefore by preserving the integrity of both natures it is necessary to find a God-man, it is not less necessary that these two natures meet in one person, just as the body and rational soul meet in one person. For otherwise it cannot be that the same person should be perfect God and perfect man.
I am pleased with all you say.
It remains for us now to inquire whence and in what way God will take on himself human nature, for either he will take it from Adam, or he will make a new man, as he made Adam from no other man. But if he makes a new man not of Adam's race, he will not belong to that human race which was born of Adam, so that he will be under no obligation to make satisfaction for it, because he will not belong to it. For, as it is right that man should make satisfaction for man's fault, it is also necessary that he who makes satisfaction should be the same person, or of the same race as the sinner, for otherwise neither Adam nor his race would make satisfaction for themselves. Therefore, as through Adam and Eve sin passed by descent to all men, no one except they themselves, or one who was born of them, ought to make satisfaction for the sins of men. Since then they themselves cannot, it is needful that one born from them should do this. Further, as Adam and his whole race by his means would have stood, without being sustained by any other creature, if he had not sinned, it is proper that if the same race rise again after the fall, it rise and stand again through itself, for by whomsoever it is restored to its original state, it will certainly stand by means of that person through whom it will recover that state. Moreover, when God, in the first instance, created human nature in Adam alone, and did not choose to form the female, so that men might be multiplied by means of the two sexes, excepting out of Adam himself, he plainly showed that he did not wish to form what he was about to form from human nature, excepting from Adam. Wherefore, if the race of Adam were raised again by any man who is not of the same race, it would not be restored to that dignity which it would have had if Adam had not sinned, and thus it would not be entirely restored, and God's plan would seem to have failed, both which things are unbefitting. It is therefore necessary that the man by whom the race of Adam is restored be taken out of Adam.
If we follow reason as we purpose doing, this must inevitably be the case.
Let us now inquire whether human nature is to be taken by God from a father and a mother, as other men are, or from a male without a female, or from a female without a male. For in whichever of these three ways it is taken, it will be from Adam and from Eve, from whom every human being of both sexes springs. And no one of these three ways is easier to God than the others, that it ought rather to be taken in that way.
You are getting on well.
But there is not need of much trouble to show that a man will be brought into existence more purely and honourably from a male or a female alone, than by the union of both, as all other sons of men are.
You say enough.
So that he must be taken either from man alone or from woman alone.
It cannot be from any other source.
God can form man in four ways, viz. Either from a man and a woman, as constant custom shows, or neither from a man or a woman, as he created Adam, or from a man without a woman, as he formed Eve, or from a woman without a man, which he has not yet done. In order, therefore, to prove that this way too was within his power, and had been reserved for this very purpose, nothing is more fitting than that he should take that man whom we are seeking for from a woman without a man. But whether it is more worthy of God that this birth should be from a virgin, or one not a virgin, there is no need to discuss, but we must undoubtedly assert that the God-man ought to be born of a virgin.
What you say delights my heart.
Is what we have said substantial or empty like the clouds, a charge which you said unbelievers urged against us?
Nothing is more substantial.
Paint, therefore, not upon empty fancies, but upon solid truth, and say that it is most suitable that just as man's sin and the cause of our condemnation had its origin in a woman, so the medicine for sin and the cause of our salvation should be born of a woman, and lest women should despair of having a share in the lot of the blessed, since so great evil proceeded from a woman, it is fitting that for the restoring of their hopes so great good should proceed from a woman. Paint this too. If it was a virgin that was the cause of so great evil to the human race, it is still more befitting that it should be a virgin who is to be the cause of all the good. Still further paint this. If the woman whom God made from a man without a woman was made from a virgin, man, it was very suitable that the man also, who should be made of a woman without a man, should be made of a virgin. But of the pictures which may be painted upon this truth, that the God-man ought to be born of a female virgin, these may now suffice.
These pictures of yours are very beautiful and reasonable.
Now we must inquire in which person God, who is three persons, should take upon him human nature, for more persons than one are unable to take the same man into a unity of person, so that this must necessarily be done in one person only. But concerning this unity of person of God and man, and in which person of the Godhead it is more proper that this be done, I have spoken, as far as I think suffices for our present inquiry, in the epistle concerning the incarnation of the Word addressed to the Lord Pope Urban.
However, please here briefly explain why the person of the Son ought to become incarnate, rather than that of the Father, or of the Holy Spirit.
If any other person becomes incarnate, there will be two sons in the Trinity, viz. The Son of God, who is a son before the Incarnation, and he who through the Incarnation will be the Son of the Virgin, and there will be, in persons who ought to be equal, an inequality in regard to the dignity of their births. For he who is born of God will have a more honourable birth than he who was born of the Virgin. Again, if the Father become incarnate, there will be two grandsons in the Trinity, because, through taking human nature, the Father will be the grandson of the parents of the Virgin, while the Word, though he has no part in human nature, will yet be the grandson of the Virgin, for he will be the son of her Son. All these things are incongruous, and do not exist in the incarnation of the Word. There is another reason why it is more proper for the Son to become incarnate than for the other persons of the Trinity, because it sounds more suitable for the Son to pray to the Father than for another person to pray to either of the others. Again, man, for whom he was to pray, and the devil, whom he was to conquer, had both, through self-will, presumptuously claimed a false likeness to God, so that they sinned, as it were, more especially against the person of the Son, who is believed to be the true likeness of God. The avenging or the pardon of this fault is therefore more appropriately assigned to him against whom the wrong had been more especially done. Wherefore, since unavoidable reason has conducted us to the following conclusions, that it is necessary a divine and a human nature meet in one person, that this cannot be done in more than one person of the Godhead, and that it is clear this is more appropriately done in the person of the Word than in the others, it is necessary that God the Word and man meet in one person.
The way by which you lead me is so walled in by reasoning on each side that I do not seem to be able to turn out of it either to the right hand or the left.
I am not leading you, but he of whom we speak, without whom we can do nothing, is leading us whenever we hold to the way of truth. But whether that man would die from his own desert, as all other men deserve to die, we need not stay to discuss, for if Adam would not have died, had he not sinned, much more that man will not need to suffer death, in whom there will be no sin because he is God.
I wish you would linger a little time over this point. For whether he be said to be able or not to be able to sin, in either case questions of no little importance arise in my mind. For if he be said to be unable to sin, it seems hard to have to believe this. For if I may speak for a little while, not about a person who has never existed, as we have hitherto done, but about him whose person and acts we have known, who can deny that he could have done many things that we call sins? For example, not to mention other things, how shall we say that he could not have lied, which is always a sin? For when he says to the Jews respecting the Father, If I should say, I know him not, I shall be a liar like unto you, and in this sentence uses the words, I know him not, who can assert that he had not the power of uttering these same four words, or in other terms have declared, I know him not? And if he had done this, as he himself says, he would have been a liar, that is, a sinner. Therefore, since he could have done this, he could have sinned.
It is true both that he could have said this and that he could not sin.
Explain this.
All power follows the will, for when I say I have power to speak or to walk, it is understood, if I will. For if the will is not taken for granted, it is not power but necessity. For when I say that I may be dragged away or conquered against my will, this is not my power but necessity, and the power of another. For to say I can be dragged away or conquered is just the same as to say another has power to drag or conquer me. We may accordingly say respecting Christ that he was able to lie, if it is understood, if he willed to do so. But since he could not lie against his will, and could not be willing to do so, he can none the less be said to have been unable to lie. Thus, therefore, he both could and could not lie.
Now let us return to our inquiry respecting this person, as though he were not yet in existence, as we did at the beginning. I say then that if he could not sin, because, as you affirm, he could not will to sin, he will retain his righteousness of necessity. Therefore he will not be righteous by the freedom of his will. What thanks then will be due to him for his righteousness? For we are wont to say that God made men and angels capable of sinning for the very purpose that when they could abandon righteousness, and yet kept it by the freedom of their will, they might deserve the thanks and praise which would not be due to them if they were righteous by necessity.
Are not the angels who are now unable to sin to be praised?
Certainly they are, for they earned the power of no longer being able to sin by the fact that they could sin, but would not.
What do you say of God, who cannot sin, and yet did not earn this through having had the power of sinning and not sinning? Is he not to be praised for his righteousness?
I wish you to answer this for me, for if I say that he is not to be praised, I know that I am lying, but if I say he is to be praised, I am afraid my argument respecting the angels breaks down.
Angels are not to be praised for their righteousness because they once could sin, but because through this fact they have gained in a certain degree from themselves the power of no longer being able to sin, in which respect they are somewhat like God, who has whatever he possesses from himself. For a person may be said to give anything who does not take it away when he can do so, or he may be said to cause anything to be when, though he has the power to prevent its being, he does not use his power. Just so, when an angel could have deprived himself of righteousness, and yet did not deprive himself, when he could have made himself unrighteous and did not do so, it is truly asserted that he gave himself righteousness and made himself righteous. In this way, therefore, he possesses a righteousness from himself, for a creature cannot possess it from himself in any other way, and therefore he is to be praised for his righteousness. And he is not righteous by necessity, but by his free will, for that is improperly called necessity, where there is neither compulsion nor prohibition. Wherefore, since God has in perfection from himself all that he possesses, he is to be praised most of all for the excellencies he possesses and retains, not by any necessity, but, as I said above, by his own eternal immutability. Thus, then, that man, who will also be God, since he will have every excellency which he will possess from himself, will be righteous not by necessity, but by free will and from himself, and therefore will be worthy of praise. For although his human nature may have what it will possess from the divine nature, yet he will also have it from himself, because the two natures will be one person.
You have satisfied me on this point, and I now see clearly that he could not sin, and yet will be worthy of praise for his righteousness. But now I think we ought to ask, since God could make such a man, why could he not make angels, and the two first human beings, such that in like manner they could not sin, and yet should be worthy of praise for their righteousness?
Do you understand what you are saying?
I think I understand, and therefore I ask why he could not make them such beings.
Because it was neither possible nor proper that any one of them should be just the same as God, as we assert of that one man. And if you ask why he did not do this in the case of as many beings as there are persons in the Godhead, or at any rate in the case of one being, I answer, because reason did not in any way require this to be done, but altogether forbade it, since God does nothing without reason.
I blush that I asked this question, but tell me, what were you going to say?
Let us say, then, that he will be under no obligation to die, because he will not be a sinner.
I ought to grant this.
End of section 8. Section 9 of Cur Deus Homo by Anselm of Canterbury, translated by Edward S. Prout. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Book 2, chapters 11 to 15. But now it remains for us to investigate whether he can die in respect to his human nature, for as regards his divine nature he will always be incorruptible.
Why ought we to doubt respecting this, since he will be a true man, and every man is naturally mortal?
I think that mortality belongs not to the pure, but to the corrupt nature of man. For if man had never sinned, and his immortality had been immutably established, he would none the less have been true man. And when mortals rise again in incorruption, they will be none the less true men. For if mortality pertains to the essence of human nature, one who was immortal could not in any way be a man. so that neither corruptibility nor incorruptibility belongs to pure human nature, since neither of them makes or destroys a man, but the one has power to make him miserable, the other blessed. But since there is no man who is not to die, mortality is included in the definition of man by philosophers who did not believe that the whole man ever could have been or can be immortal. Therefore the fact that the man we are speaking of will be true man is not sufficient to prove that he ought to be mortal.
Seek then for another reason, for I know of none, if you do not, by which it may be proved that he is able to die.
There is no doubt about that. As he will be God, he will also be omnipotent.
That is true.
If therefore he wills it, he will be able to lay down his life and to take it again.
If he cannot, it seems that he is not omnipotent.
He can therefore never die if he wills it, or he can die and rise again, but whether he lays down his life without the action of anyone else, or by permitting another to act in such a way that he lays down his life, makes no difference in regard to his power.
There's no doubt of that.
If, therefore, he were willing to permit it, he could be put to death, and if he were unwilling, he could not.
Reason inevitably conducts us to this.
Reason also has taught us that he ought to have something greater than anything beneath God, that he may offer it to God of his own free will, and not as a debt.
It is so.
But this cannot be found either beneath him or apart from him.
True.
It must therefore be found in himself.
That follows.
Either, therefore, he will give himself or something belonging to himself.
I cannot understand it in any other way.
Now we must inquire of what kind this gift ought to be, for he will not be able to give himself or anything belonging to himself to God, as though he were his own and did not belong to God, since every creature is God's.
It is so.
This gift must therefore be understood in the following way, that he will devote himself or something belonging to himself to the honor of God, in some way in which he is under no obligation to act.
That follows from what has been said before.
If we say that he will give himself up to the will of God, so that by steadfastly retaining righteousness he will submit himself to the will of God, he will not give that which God may not require from him as a debt, for every rational creature owes this obedience to God.
This cannot be denied.
So it is needful for him to give himself or something belonging to himself in some other way.
Reason shuts us up to this conclusion.
Let us see if perchance this may be by giving his life, or laying down his life, or delivering himself to death for the honor of God. For God will not require this from him as a debt. For since there will be no sin in him, he will be under no obligation to die, as we have already said.
I cannot conceive it otherwise.
Let us further consider whether in this way it may be agreeable to reason.
Tell me yourself, and I will gladly listen.
If man sinned by self-indulgence, is it not suitable that he should make satisfaction by severe endurance? And if he was so easily conquered by the devil that by sinning he dishonored God in the easiest way possible, is it not just that man, when making satisfaction to God for sin, should, for the honor of God, overcome the devil with the greatest possible difficulty? Or is it not meet that he who by sinning stole himself away from God as completely as he possibly could do so, should, in making satisfaction, surrender himself to God as completely as he can do so?
Nothing is more reasonable.
But there is nothing more severe and arduous that a man can suffer for the honor of God of his own accord, and not as a matter of debt, than death. And there is no way in which a man can more entirely give himself up to God than when he delivers himself up to death for his honor.
All these things are true.
It is needful, therefore, that he who wishes to make satisfaction for the sin of man must be one who can die if he wills to do so.
I see clearly that that man whom we are seeking for ought to be one who will die neither by necessity, for he will be omnipotent, nor by desert, for he will never be a sinner, and yet one who can die of his own free will, because it will be needful.
There are many other reasons why it is most suitable for him to be made in the likeness and live the life of men, yet without sin, which are more easily and clearly seen of themselves in his life and labors than they can be shown by reason alone before the trial was made. For who can explain how necessarily, how wisely, it was ordered that he who was to redeem men, and by teaching them to lead them back from the way of death and destruction into the way of eternal life and blessedness, should spend his life among men, and by his very course of life, while he was teaching them by word how they ought to live, should himself give them an example. But how could he give himself as an example to weak and mortal men, that they should not draw back from righteousness on account of injuries or insults or pains or death itself, if they did not recognize that he himself experienced these things?
All these things show plainly that he ought to be mortal and a sharer in our trials. But all these things are our miseries. Will he then be miserable?
Not at all, for as any advantages which a person possesses against his will does not bring happiness, so it is not misery to experience for some good reason, under no necessity, some trial of our own free will.
That must be granted. But in this resemblance, which he ought to have to men, tell me whether he will share our ignorance as well as our other infirmities.
Why do you doubt respecting God, whether he knows all things?
Because although he will be immortal from his divine nature, he will be mortal from his human nature. For why may he not, like others, as man, be really ignorant, just as he will be really mortal?
That taking of human nature into unity with the person of God will be done only wisely by the supreme wisdom, and so he will not take in human nature what is in no way useful, but is very prejudicial to the work which that man is about to do, for ignorance would not be useful to him in anything, but prejudicial in many ways. For how will he perform the many and great works he is to do without the highest wisdom? Or how will men believe what he says, if they know him to be ignorant? But even if they do not know this, of what use will that ignorance be to him? Further, if nothing is loved except what is known, as there will be nothing good that he does not love, there will be no good thing that he will be ignorant of. But no one perfectly knows what is good except he who knows how to distinguish it from what is evil. No one who is ignorant of evil knows how to make this distinction. As therefore he of whom we are speaking will perfectly know all good, he will be ignorant respecting nothing which is evil. He will therefore have all knowledge, although he may not show it publicly in his intercourse with men.
It seems that it will be so in his adult age. But in childhood, as it will not be a suitable time for the wisdom to appear in him, so there will be no need of it, and so it will not be fit for him to possess it.
Did I not say that this incarnation will be effected wisely? For it will be in a wise way God will assume mortal nature, which he will employ wisely, because most usefully. But he cannot wisely take on him ignorance, for ignorance is never useful, but always prejudicial, except perchance when some wicked will, which will never exist in him, is restrained from effecting its purpose. For although sometimes it is not hurtful in any other way, it is injurious in this one respect, that it deprives of the benefit of knowledge. And briefly, to settle your question, from the moment that man will exist, he will always be full of God, as he will be of himself, whence it follows that he will never be without God's power and strength and wisdom.
Although I did not doubt that this was always the case with Christ, yet I put the question that I might hear a reason for this also. For we often feel sure that something is true, and yet do not know how to prove it by reason. Now I ask you to teach me how his death outweighs the number and greatness of all sins, since you show that one sin, which we think very trifling, is so infinite, that if an infinite number of worlds were placed before us, as full of creatures as this is, which could not be saved from annihilation unless someone took a single look contrary to the will of God, yet it ought not to be taken.
If that man we are speaking of were before you, and you were told that unless you killed him, this whole world and all that is not God would perish, would you do this for the sake of preserving every other creature?
I would not do it, even if an infinite number of worlds were placed before me.
What if it were said to thee again, either kill him, or all the sins of the world will come upon thee?
I would answer that I would prefer to endure all the sins, past and future, not only of this world, but also all that in addition to these can be conceived, rather than do that single act. And I think I ought to give the same answer not only respecting his death, but in regard to any slight injury that might be done to him.
You think rightly. But tell me why your heart judges that it would dread one sin that would injure that man more than all other sins that can be conceived, since all sins that are committed are against him.
Because a sin which is committed against his person surpasses beyond comparison all those which can be conceived of apart from his person.
What will you say on this point? That one often willingly suffers some injuries in his own person, lest he should suffer more serious injuries in his property.
That God, to whose power all things are subject, does not need to endure such a loss, as you answered before to one of my questions.
You answer well. We see, therefore, that no magnitude or multitude of sins apart from the person of God can be compared to an injury done to the bodily life of this man.
That is very clear.
How great a good does this life seem to be, since its destruction is so evil?
If its existence is as great a good as its destruction is an evil, this good is, beyond comparison, far greater than is the evil of those sins, which are yet surpassed beyond estimation in wickedness by the destruction of that life.
You say the truth. Consider also that sins are as hateful as they are evil, and that life is as precious as it is good. Whence it follows that that life is more precious than sins are hateful.
I cannot fail to see this.
Do you think that a good so great, so precious, can suffice to pay what is due for the sins of the whole world?
Verily, it is worth infinitely more.
You see then how this life may overcome all sins, if it is given for them.
Plainly.
If then to give life is the same as to accept death, just as the giving of this life outweighs all the sins of men, so too does the accepting of death.
It is certain that this is the case in regard to all those sins which do not affect the person of God. But now I see another subject for inquiry. For if to kill him is as great an evil as his life is good, how can his death overcome and blot out the sins of those who slew him? Or, if it blots out the sins of any one of them, how is it that it cannot blot out any sin of all the rest of men? For we believe that many of them have been saved, and that numberless others are not saved.
The apostle solves this question by saying, had they known it, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. For there is so great difference between a sin willfully committed and one done through ignorance, that an evil deed, which they never could have done on account of its enormity, if it had been recognized, becomes venial, because it is done in ignorance. For no one could be willing, at least knowingly, to kill a divine being. So those who killed him in ignorance did not plunge into that infinite sin with which no other sins can be compared. For we have been considering the enormity of that crime, with a view to see how valuable that life was, not as though it had been committed ignorantly, but as if it were committed willfully, a thing which no one ever had done or could do.
You have shown with good reason that the murderers of Christ might attain to the pardon of their sin.
What do you seek more? For see, already you perceive how a reasonable necessity shows that the celestial state is to be completed from among men, and that this cannot be done except by the remission of sins, which no man can have excepting by means of a man who is also himself God, and who reconciles sinful men to God by his death. Clearly then we find that Christ, whom we acknowledge to be God and man, died on our behalf. But if this is acknowledged without any doubt, neither is there any doubt that all things which he himself says are certainly true, since God cannot lie, and that whatever he has done has been wisely done, though we may not clearly discern the reason for them.
What you say is true, nor have I the slightest doubt that what he said was true, or what he did was done with a good reason. But I ask this, that in regard to matters in the Christian faith, which seem to unbelievers as though they ought not or cannot be done, you explain to me for what reason they are right or possible. I ask this not that you may establish me in the faith, but that you may delight in one who is already established by a comprehension of the truth itself.
End of section 9. Section 10 of Cur Deus Homo by Anselm of Canterbury, translated by Edward S. Prout. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Book 2, chapters 16 to 18, part 1.
Wherefore, as you have explained the reason of the facts which have been mentioned above, I beg you also to show the reason of those I am going to ask you about. In the first place, viz., how did God take on himself from the sinful mass, i.e., from human nature, which was entirely infected with sin, a man without a sin, like something unleavened out of a mass of fermentation? For granted that the conception of that man is pure and free from the sin of carnal delight, yet the Virgin herself, from whom he was taken, was shapen in iniquity, and in sin did her mother conceive her, and she was born in original sin, for she herself sinned in Adam, in whom all sinned.
After it is settled that that man is God and the reconciler of sinners, there is no doubt that he is altogether free from sin. But this cannot be unless he was taken from the sinful mass without sin. If we cannot understand by what method God effected this, we ought not to wonder, but to admit with reverence that there is somewhat in the secrets of so great a matter which we are ignorant of. For God has recreated human nature in a more wonderful way than he created it. For either work was equally easy to God. But before man existed, he had not, by sinning, given a reason why he should not be made. But after he was made, by sinning he deserved to lose both his existence and the end for which he was made. Yet he has not altogether lost his existence, in order that he might be a creature whom God should either punish or pity. For neither of these things could take place if he had been annihilated. Therefore God effected his restoration in a more wonderful way than his creation, since he effected the former on behalf of a sinner against his desert, but the other on behalf of one not a sinner, and not against his desert. How great a marvel also it is for God and man to meet in one person, so that while the integrity of both natures is preserved, the same person should be man and God. Who therefore may presume even to imagine that the intellect of man can fully discern how wisely so inscrutable a work has been effected?
I agree with you that no man can fully explain so great a secret in this life. Nor do I ask you to do what no one can do, but do as much as you can. For you will more easily persuade me that deeper reasons lie hidden in the subject if you show that you see some reason in it, than if by saying nothing you prove that you perceive none.
I see that I cannot be released from your importunity, but if I can to any degree explain what you ask, let us give thanks to God, but if I cannot, let the proofs given above suffice. For since it is certain that God ought to be made man, there is no doubt that his wisdom and power will not fail to secure that this be effected without sin.
That I willingly admit.
It was certainly necessary that that redemption which Christ effected should avail not only for those who were alive at the time, but for others also. For suppose there is a king, and all the people of one of his cities, with the exception of one man, who was yet of their race, have so sinned that he cannot allow any of them to escape the condemnation of death. But suppose that single innocent man has such favour with the king, and such love toward the guilty, as to be both able and willing to reconcile to the king all who trust his plan by some service, very pleasing to the king himself, which he will do on a day appointed by the king's will. And since all who need to be reconciled cannot meet on that day, the king grants, on account of the greatness of that service, that all who either before or afterwards have acknowledged that they are willing to seek pardon through that work which will be done on that day, and to enter into the agreement then made, shall be absolved from every past fault. And if it shall happen that after this pardon should any sin again, if they are willing to make satisfaction in a proper way, and subsequently amend, that they may again receive pardon through the efficacy of the same agreement, but yet that no one should enter the king's palace until the deed was done on account of which the sins are to be remitted. According to this illustration, since all the men who are to be saved could not be present when Christ effected that redemption, so great was the efficacy of his death that its virtue extended even to those who were not living at that place or time. But that it ought to avail not only for those who were present is easily learned from this, that there could not be as many present at his death as are necessary for the building up of the celestial state, even though all who were living anywhere at the time of his death were admitted to the benefit of that redemption. For there are more demons than there were men living at that day, from whom the number of lost demons is to be made up. Nor is it to be believed that since man was created there has been any time in which that world, with the creatures which were made for the use of man, has been so empty that there was no one of the human race living in it who had no share in that heavenly state for which man was made. For it seems incongruous that God, even for a single moment, should have permitted the human race, and those things which were made for the use of the men from whom the heavenly state is to be completed, to have existed as it were in vain. For they would seem to exist to a certain extent in vain when they appeared not to be serving the purpose for which they were chiefly created.
You show by appropriate reasoning, which nothing seems to contradict, that there never has been a time since man was created without someone existing who had part in that reconciliation, without which every man would have been made in vain. So that we may conclude that this was not only proper, but even necessary. For if this is more proper and reasonable than that at one time there was not a single person in existence in whom God's purpose, for which he made man, would be accomplished, and there is nothing opposed to this reasoning, it is necessary that someone was always living who had a part in the foretold reconciliation. So there is no doubt that Adam and Eve had part in that redemption, though divine authority does not clearly announce this.
It seems also incredible that since God made them and formed an unalterable purpose to make from them all the men whom he would take to the celestial state, he should have excluded these two from his purpose.
Yes, indeed, we ought to believe that he made them on purpose that they might have their place among those redeemed ones on account of whom they have been created.
You think rightly. However, no soul could enter the celestial paradise before the death of Christ, as I said above in regard to the king's palace.
So we hold.
But that virgin from whom the man we are speaking of was taken was one of those who before his birth had been purified by him from sins, and it was in her state of purity he was taken from her.
But what you say would please me very much. Only whereas he ought to have purity from sin from himself, he seems to have it from his mother, and thus to be pure not by himself, but by her.
Not so, but since his mother's purity by which he is pure came only from him, he also is pure by himself and from himself.
On this point all is well, but there seems to be yet another thing to be inquired into. For we said above that he was not to die by necessity, and now we see that his mother was made pure by his death hereafter. But unless she had been pure, he could not have been born from her at all. How then is it that he did not die by necessity, since he could not have existed except for the fact that he was about to die? For if he had not been about to die, the virgin from whom he was taken would not have been pure, since she could not become so in any way but by believing in the reality of his death. Nor could he have been taken from her if she had not been pure. So that if he did not die of necessity after he was taken from the Virgin, he could not have been taken from her after he was taken, which is impossible.
If you had well considered what has been previously said, I think you would clearly have seen that your question has been answered.
I do not see how.
When we inquired whether he had the power to lie, did we not show that in lying there were two powers, viz., one of choosing to lie, and the other of uttering the lie, and that though he had the power to utter a lie, it was from himself that he had the power of not choosing to lie, so that he is to be praised for his own righteousness, by which he kept the truth.
It is so.
In the same way, with regard to preserving one's own life, there is the power of willing to preserve it, and the power of actually preserving it. When therefore it is asked whether this God-man could have preserved his life so as never to die, we must not doubt that he always had the power of preserving it, though he could not have willed to preserve it so as never to die. And since it was from himself that he had this power, viz., that he could not will to preserve his life, he laid it down, not of necessity, but by his own free power.
Those two powers he possessed, viz., of lying and preserving life, were not quite alike. For in the one case it follows that if he willed it, he could lie. But in the other case it seems that if he had willed not to die, he could no more carry out his will than he could avoid being what he was. For he became man for the very purpose of dying. And on account of this future death, it was possible for him to be born of the Virgin, as you said before.
In the same way as you think that he could not avoid dying, or that he died by necessity because he could not avoid being what he was, you might assert that he could not will not to die, or that he necessarily willed to die because he could not avoid being what he was. For he was not made man for the purpose of dying more than for the purpose of choosing to die. Wherefore, as you ought not to say that he had no power to avoid choosing to die, or that he chose to die by necessity, so you must not say that he had no power to avoid dying, or that he died by necessity.
Yes, but since both the act of dying and the choosing to die come under the same principle, both seem to have been of necessity in his case.
Who was it that of his own accord willed to make himself man, that by the same immutable will he might die, and that by faith in this undoubted truth the virgin from whom that man was to be taken would be made pure?
God, the Son of God.
Was it not shown above that the will of God is coerced by no necessity, but of itself keeps itself by its own free immutability, when it is said to do anything by necessity?
That has been truly shown. But we see, on the other hand, that what God unchangeably wills cannot but exists of necessity. Therefore, if God willed that man should die, he could not but die.
From the fact that the Son of God took human nature with the design of dying, you prove that this same man could not but die.
So I understand.
Was it not equally clear from what was said that the Son of God and the man taken by him are one person, so that the same being may be both God and man, the Son of God and the Son of the Virgin?
It is so.
It was by his own will, therefore, that the same man could not but die, and actually died.
I cannot deny it.
Since, therefore, the will of God does a thing by no necessity, but by his own power, and the will of that man was the will of God, he died by no necessity, but by his own power.
I cannot meet your arguments, for I am unable in any way to invalidate either the premises you lay down or the conclusions you draw. But still this difficulty I mentioned always confronts me, viz., that if he willed not to die, he had no more power to carry out his will than to avoid being what he was, for in fact he was going to die. Since if he had not been really going to die, there would have been no true faith in his future death, by which both that virgin from whom he was born and many others have been cleansed from sin. Now if this had not been a true faith, it could have profited nothing. Therefore, if he had power not to die, he had power to make that not to be true which was true.
Was it true before he died that he was going to die?
Because he himself willed to do this freely and by an immutable choice.
If therefore, as you say, he could not but die, because he was really going to die, and yet was really going to die for the very reason that he freely and unalterably chose to do so, it follows that he could not but die, for no other reason than because, by his unalterable choice, he willed to die.
It is so, but whatever the cause was, it is nevertheless true that he could not but die, and that it was necessary for him to die.
You make a difficulty where there is none, and as the saying is, you seek for a knot in the bulrush.
Have you forgotten the objection I took to your excuses at the beginning of this discussion of ours, viz., that you would do what I asked, not for the learned, but for myself and those inquiring with me on this subject? Bear with me, therefore, that I put questions suitable to the sloth and dullness of our minds, so that you may give satisfaction to me and to them, even in childish questions, as you began to do.
We have already stated that it is not proper to say that God cannot do anything, or that he does it by necessity, for every necessity and impossibility is subject to his will. But his will is subject to no necessity or impossibility, for nothing is necessary or impossible, except because he himself so wills it. But it is utterly untrue that he himself either wills or refrains from willing anything on account of necessity or impossibility. Since, therefore, he does all things that he wills to do, and only those, as no necessity or impossibility precedes his willing or not willing, so neither does it precede his doing or not doing a thing, although he may unalterably will many things and do them. And as when God does a thing, after it is done, it is now impossible for it not to be done, but it is always true that it has been done. Yet it is not correct to say that it is impossible for God not to make what is past not to be past. For in that matter the necessity of not doing or the impossibility of doing it has no place, but the will of God alone, who, because he himself is truth, wills truth to be always unalterable, as indeed it is. Thus, too, if he purposes that he will unalterably do something, although what he purposes before it is done must be about to be done, yet in him there is no necessity of doing it or impossibility of not doing it, because his will alone works in him. For whenever it is said that God cannot, there is no denial of his power, but some power and strength is indicated which cannot be overcome. For nothing is meant but that no power can cause him to do what it is said he cannot do. For language of this kind is often used, as when it is said that a thing can be, not because the power is in that thing, but because in something else, or that it cannot be, not because the want of power is in itself, but in something else. For we say that man can be conquered, meaning someone has power to conquer him, and we say he cannot be conquered, meaning no one has power to conquer him. For to be able to be conquered is not power, but want of power, and to be unable to be conquered is not want of power, but power. Nor do we say that God does anything by necessity, meaning that in him there is any necessity, but because there is in something else, as I remarked respecting inability, when it is said he cannot. For every kind of necessity is either compulsion or prevention, and these two necessities are mutually contradictory, like the terms necessary and impossible. For whatever is compelled to be is prevented from not being, and what is compelled not to be is prevented from being, just as it is impossible for what is necessary to be not to be, and it is equally impossible for what is necessary not to be, and vice versa. For when we say that anything is necessary or not necessary in God, it is not meant that in him there is any necessity that compels or prevents, but it is meant that in all other things there is a necessity preventing them from acting and compelling them not to act, in opposition to what is asserted respecting God. For example, when we say that it is necessary for God always to speak the truth, and it is necessary for him never to lie, nothing else is meant than that there is in him so great a steadfastness in keeping to the truth that it is impossible for anything to have the power to make him either not tell the truth or lie. Therefore, when we say that that man, who according to the unity of his person, as has already been said, is the same as God, the Son of God, could not but die, or could not choose not to die after he was born of the Virgin, it is not meant that he had any inability to preserve, or to choose to preserve, his own immortal life, but that he was unalterable in his purpose, by which he freely made himself man, for this very object, viz., that by persisting in the same choice he might die, and that nothing could change that choice. For it would rather be powerlessness than power, if he could choose to lie, or to deceive, or to change his will, which previously he willed to be unchangeable. And if, as I said above, when anyone freely purposes to do some good deed, and by the same will afterwards performs what he purposed, even though he might be compelled, if he were unwilling to perform his promise, he should not be said to do what he does from necessity, but by that same free will with which he purposed it. For a thing ought not to be said to be done, or not to be done, by necessity or inability, where neither necessity nor inability have anything to do with it, but only free will. If then, I say, it is so in a man, much more should necessity and inability never be mentioned in connection with God, who does nothing but what he wills, and whose will no force is able to compel or to restrain. Moreover, for this object the diversity of natures and unity of person in Christ was of value, and thus whatever needed to be done for the restoration of men, if the human nature could not do it, the divine nature might, and if there were anything incongruous to the divine nature, the human nature might manifest it. And yet it would not be sometimes one person and sometimes another, but the very same person, who existing perfectly in both natures, through the human might pay what it owed, and through the divine would be able to pay what it was expedient should be paid. Finally, the Virgin, who by faith was made pure, that he might be taken from her, did not at all believe that he would die unless because he willed it, as she had learned from the prophet who said, he was offered because he himself willed it. Therefore, since her faith was true, it was necessary that it should be as she believed. But if it still troubles you that I say it was necessary, remember that the truth of the Virgin's faith was not the cause of his dying voluntarily, but because this death was about to take place, her faith was true. Wherefore, if it is said it was necessary he should die of his own free will alone, because the faith or the prophecy on this point, which had gone before, was true, this is the same as to say it was necessary it should be so, since it was to be so. But necessity of this kind does not compel a fact to exist, but the existence of the fact causes the necessity. For there is an antecedent necessity, which is the cause of a fact existing, and there is a subsequent necessity which the fact causes. It is an antecedent and efficient necessity when it is said the sky revolves, because it is necessary that it should revolve. But it is a subsequent necessity which affects nothing, but is itself caused, when I say that you necessarily speak because you are speaking. For when I say this, I mean that nothing can cause you not to be speaking at the same time that you are speaking, but I do not mean that someone else is compelling you to speak. Now, natural law compels the sky to revolve, but no necessity causes you to speak. But in every case there is both an antecedent and a subsequent necessity, yet it does not follow that where the subsequent necessity exists, the antecedent is forthwith to be found. For we may say it is necessary for the sky to revolve because it does revolve, but it is not in the same way true that you speak because you must speak. That subsequent necessity runs through all times in this way: whatever has been must have been, whatever is must be, whatever is to be necessarily will be. This is that necessity which, in the work where Aristotle treats of singular and future propositions, seems to pull down everything and to build all things up on necessity. It was by this necessity, which was subsequent and affected nothing, since both faith and prophecy respecting Christ were true, because he was about to die of his own free will, not of necessity, that it was necessary for things to be as they were. By this necessity he was made man, by this he did and suffered all that he did do and suffer. By this he willed whatever he did will, for these things were so by necessity, because they were going to be, and they were going to be because they had been, and they have been because they have been. And if you wish to know the real necessity of all things which he did and suffered, know that all things took place necessarily because he himself willed them, but no necessity preceded his will. Wherefore, if these things did not take place except because he willed it, if he had not willed it, they would not have taken place. It was in this way, therefore, that no man took his life from him, but he laid it down of himself, and took it again, because he had the power to lay down his life and to take it again, as he himself said.
You have satisfied me that he cannot be proved to have submitted to death by any necessity, and I do not repent that I appeared so importunate for you to do this.
We have shown, I think, a plain way in which God may have taken human nature without sin from the sinful mass, but I do not think it is at all to be denied that there may be some other way besides that we have mentioned, only with this reservation, that God can do what man's reason cannot comprehend. But since the one we have given seems to me sufficient, and if I wished now to seek for another, it would be needful to inquire what original sin is, and how it passed from our first parents to the whole human race, with the exception of that man of whom we are speaking, and also to touch upon some other questions which demand their own treatment. Let us be content with the explanation we have given, and proceed to the remainder of the work we have undertaken.
As you wish, but on the condition that at some time, with the help of God, you will feel bound to explain that other reason which now you decline to investigate.
Since I know that I should like to do this, I do not refuse your request, but since I am uncertain concerning the future, I dare not promise, but commit the matter to God's disposal. But tell me now what you think remains to be solved in regard to the question which you proposed at the beginning, and as a consequence of which many others have accumulated.
The main question was, why God was made man, that he might save man by his death, when it seems as though he could have done this in some other way. In reply to which you have shown by many and necessary arguments that the restoration of human nature ought not to remain unaccomplished, but yet could not be effected unless man paid to God what he owed for sin, and which debt was so great that though no one ought to pay for it who was not man, no one could pay for it who was not God, so that the same person must be both man and God. Whence it was necessary that God should take man into the unity of his person, so that he who in his own nature ought to pay and could not, might be in a person who could. In fine, you have shown that the man who was also God was to be taken out of a virgin, and from the person of the Son of God, and how he could be taken without sin from the sinful mass. Moreover, you have most clearly proved that the life of this man was so exalted and so precious that it may suffice to pay what is due for the sins of the whole world and infinitely more. It remains, therefore, now to show how that life is paid to God for the sins of men.
End of section 10. Section 11 of Cur Deus Homo by Anselm of Canterbury, translated by Edward S. Prout. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Book 2, Chapters 18, Part 2 to 22. If for righteousness' sake he permitted himself to be slain, did he not give his life for the honor of God?
If I can understand what I have no doubt about, although I may not see how he did this with good reason, since he had power both to preserve righteousness unalterably and his own life eternally, I will confess that he freely gave to God, for his honor, an offering to which nothing which is not God can be compared, and which can compensate for all the debts of all men.
Do you not see that when he endured with uncomplaining patience injuries and insults and the death of the cross with robbers, brought on him, as we said above, on account of the righteousness which he kept with perfect obedience, he gave men an example that, on account of no trials which they can experience, they should turn away from the righteousness which they owe to God. But he would not at all have given this example, if, using the power which he possessed, he had turned away from the death brought upon him for such a cause.
It seems there was no necessity that he should give this example. For many before his advent, and John the Baptist after his birth, but before his death, by bravely enduring death for the sake of the truth, are known to have sufficiently set an example on this point.
No man beside him ever gave to God by dying what he would not at some time have necessarily lost, or paid what he did not owe. But this man freely offered to the Father what it would never have been necessary for him to lose, and paid for sinners what he did not owe for himself. Therefore he much more gave us an example, that each one should not hesitate of his own accord, when reason requires, to surrender for himself to God that which at some time he must undoubtedly lose. For he, though under no necessity on his own account, and no compulsion on account of others, to whom he owed nothing but punishment, yet yielded up so precious a life, even himself, that is to say, so exalted a person as he was, with such a ready will.
You nearly explain what I want to know. But suffer me to ask you something which, although you may, perhaps, think it is foolish to ask, yet I could not readily answer if the question were put to me. You say that when he died, he gave what he did not owe. But no one will deny that when he gave this example in such a way, he did a better thing, and what pleased God more than if he had not done so. Nor will anyone say that he was under no obligation to do what he thought to be better and more pleasing to God. How then shall we assert that he did not owe to God what he did, that is, what he thought was better and more pleasing to God, especially since the creature owes to God all that is and knows and is able to do?
Although the creature has nothing from itself, yet when God grants him leave to do or not to do anything, he puts both courses of action so far within his power that, though one course may be the better, neither can be definitely required. But whether he takes the better course or the other, he may be said to do his duty in what he does, and if he takes the better course, he has a reward, because he freely gives what is his own. For though celibacy is better than marriage, neither of them is definitely required from a man, but both he who prefers to enjoy marriage and he who prefers to preserve his celibacy is said to do his duty in what he does. For no one says that there ought to be no choice between celibacy and marriage. But we say that a man ought to do what he prefers before he determines on either of these states. And if he keeps his celibacy, he expects a reward for the spontaneous gift which he offers up to God. When therefore you say that the creature owes to God what he knows to be best, and is able to do, if you mean as a debt, and do not understand, should God command it, it is not always true, since, as I said, a man does not owe celibacy as a debt, but if he prefers it, he ought to enjoy marriage. But if the word ought troubles you, and you cannot understand it except in the case of some debt, know that, as it happens that the words able and not able and necessity are sometimes used, not because the ability or necessity exists in the things in connection with which the terms are used, but in something else, so is it with the word ought. For when, for example, we say that the poor ought to receive alms from the rich, it means the same as that the rich ought to give alms to the poor. For this is a debt to be exacted not from the poor man, but from the rich. It is said also that God ought to be over all things, not because in this matter he is in any way a debtor, but because all things ought to be in subjection to him, and ought to do what he wills, since what he wills ought to be. So when any creature wills to do what he has the right to do or not to do, it is said that he ought to do it, because what he wills ought to be. So too the Lord Jesus, since he willed to endure death, as we said, because he had the right either to suffer or not to suffer, ought to do what he did, because what he willed ought to be done. And yet he was not bound to do it, because it was not a debt. For since he is both God and man, according to his human nature, from the time that he became man, he received from the divine nature, which is different from the human, the power to claim as his own whatever he possessed, so that he was not bound to give anything except what he wished. But regarded in his personality, he had all that he possessed so entirely from himself, and was so perfectly self-sufficient, that he neither owed any recompense to any other, nor did he need to give that it might be recompensed to him again.
I now see clearly that it was on no account as a debt, as my reason seemed to show me, that he gave himself up for the honor of God, and yet that he ought to do what he did.
That honor in truth pertains to the whole Trinity. Wherefore, since he himself is God, the Son of God, he offered himself for his own honor to himself, as he did to the Father and the Holy Spirit, i.e., his human nature to his divine nature, which is also one of the three persons. However, that we may speak more clearly what we wish, while abiding in the same truth, let us say, as is our wont, that the Son freely offered himself to the Father. For in this way it is most clearly expressed, both because in one person the whole Godhead is meant, to whom he offered himself by virtue of his human nature, and because, by using the name of Father and Son, a certain overwhelming feeling of reverence is experienced in the hearts of those who hear, when the Son is said in this way to supplicate the Father on our behalf.
This I most willingly admit.
Let us now examine, as far as we can, for what great reason man's salvation follows from his death.
My heart yearns for this, for although I seem to understand it for myself, I should like the argument to be unfolded by you.
There is no need to explain how great was the gift which the Son freely gave.
That is plain enough.
You will not think that he who freely gives to God so great a gift ought to be without a recompense?
No, for I certainly see it is necessary that the Father recompense the Son. Otherwise he seems to be unjust if he is unwilling, or powerless if he is unable to do so, both which are foreign to the nature of God.
He who recompenses anyone either gives him what he has not, or forgives what might be required from him. But before the Son did this great work, all things that the Father had were his, and he did not owe anything that could be forgiven him. What then shall be recompense to one in need of nothing, to whom there is nothing that can be given or forgiven?
I see, on the one hand, the necessity of making a recompense, and on the other hand its impossibility, because it is needful for God to pay what he owes, and yet there is no one to whom he can pay it.
If so great and well-deserved a reward is paid neither to him nor to anyone else, the Son will seem to have accomplished his great work in vain.
It is a sin to suppose this.
It is needful, therefore, that the payment be made to someone else, since it cannot be to him.
That inevitably follows.
If the Son willed to give to another what is due to himself, could the Father rightly forbid him, or refuse to give it to that other?
No, for I see it is both just and necessary that it should be given by the Father to whomsoever the Son wills, both because the Son has a right to give what is his own, and the Father can only give to someone else what is due to him.
To whom could he assign the fruit and recompense of his death more suitably than to those for whose salvation, as truthful reasoning has taught us, he made himself man, and to whom, as we said, by his death he gave an example of dying on behalf of righteousness. For will they not be imitators of him to no purpose, if they have no share in his merit? Or whom will he more justly make inheritors of what is due to him, which he does not himself need, and of the superabundance of his own fullness, than his parents and brethren, whom he sees bound down by so many and great debts, and pining away in profound misery, so that what they owe for their sins may be forgiven them, and what they need on account of their sins may be given them?
The whole world can hear nothing more reasonable, or sweet, or desirable. I indeed derive so much confidence from this, that I cannot tell you with what great joy my heart bounds. For it seems to me that God can reject no one who draws near to him in this name.
It is so if he draws near as he ought to, but in what way we are to gain access to a share in so great a favour, and how we are to live in it, Holy Scripture everywhere teaches us, which is established on solid truth, that with God's help we have to a certain extent examined, as on a firm foundation.
Indeed, whatever is established on this foundation is founded on a solid rock.
I think I have now, to some slight extent, satisfied your inquiry, although it would be possible for me to do this better more at length, and there are reasons for this truth more important and more numerous than my own or any mortal mind can comprehend. For it is clear that God was under no necessity to do that of which we have been speaking, but that his immutable truth required it to be so. For granted it may be said that what that man did, God did, on account of the unity of person, God was yet under no necessity to descend from heaven in order to overcome the devil, nor to contend against him by a judicial process so as to deliver man. But God did require at man's hand that he should overcome the devil, and that he who had offended God by sin should make satisfaction by means of righteousness. At any rate, God owed nothing to the devil but punishment, nor did man owe him anything except that, having been conquered by him, he should, in his turn, reconquer him. But whatever was required from him was due to God, not to the devil. We have found, too, that the mercy of God, which seemed to you to be clean gone when we were looking at the justice of God and the sin of man, is so great and in such harmony with his justice that it cannot be imagined to be either greater or more just. For what greater mercy can be conceived than when God the Father says to the sinner condemned to eternal torments, and having no power to redeem himself from them, accept my only begotten Son, and give him for thyself? And when the Son himself says, Take me and redeem thyself. For it is as though they were saying these very words when they summon us and draw us to the Christian faith. For what is more just than that he to whom a price is paid more valuable than all the debt, if it is given with the proper disposition, should forgive the whole debt? You will see that the reconciliation of the devil respecting which you inquired is impossible if you carefully consider man's reconciliation, for as man could not be reconciled except by a God-man who can die, through whose righteousness what God had lost by man's sin might be restored, so the condemned angels cannot be saved except by a God-angel who can die, and who, by his righteousness, can make reparation to God for that which the sins of the rest took away. And as man ought not to be raised again by another man who was not of the same race, though he were of the same nature, so no angel ought to be saved by another angel, although all are of the same nature, because they are not all of the same race as men are. Footnote: This was one of the speculations of the schoolmen. It is assumed that angels are distinct and isolated creations of God. They are of the same nature, but not of one race. Thus the fall of one does not involve the fall of others, and it is inferred, first, that no being could stand in the same relation to fallen angels that Christ did to fallen men, and second, that they could not be saved in any other way. The possibility of the restoration of the devil had been speculation of Origen and a few of the fathers after him, but was generally rejected. End footnote. For all the angels are not sprung from one angel, as all men are from one man. Then, too, this fact prevents their restoration, that as they fell, though no one else by injuring them caused their fall, so without any other person's help they ought to rise again, and this is impossible for them, for they cannot in any other way be restored to the dignity which they would have held, because without help from another, by their own power they would have stood in the truth if they had not sinned. Therefore, if anyone thinks that our Saviour's redemption ought at the same time to be extended even to them by reasoning, he is convicted of being deceived by reasoning. But I do not say this as if the price paid by his death may not, through its great value, avail for the sins of men and of angels, but that immutable reasoning is opposed to the restoration of the lost angels.
All that you say seems to me to be reasonable and irrefutable, and by the solution of the one question which we proposed, I see that whatever is contained in the Old and New Testament has been proved. For since you thus prove that God was necessarily made man, even if the few things which you quoted from our books were left out, as, for example, your remarks on the three persons of the Godhead and on Adam, you would satisfy by reason alone not only Jews but even pagans, and the God-man himself establishes the New Testament and proves the truth of the Old Testament. And as it is necessary for his own truthfulness to be confessed, no one can refuse to confess all that is contained in those books to be true.
If we have said anything that needs to be corrected, I do not refuse correction, if it is made with good reason. But if what we think we have discovered by reason is confirmed by the testimony of the truth, we ought to attribute this not to ourselves, but to God, who is blessed forever. Amen. End of section 11. End of Cur Deus Homo by Anselm of Canterbury, translated by Edward S. Prout.